Before we descend into the shadows of February 1934, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this documentary, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel far more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference, and if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If this kind of content speaks to you, consider subscribing. It keeps stories like this coming. Before we begin, I want to give a massive thank you to Shorpio for suggesting this story. Your support and ideas make this channel possible. Now let me take you back to a cold morning in Belgium, when a nation woke to news that would echo through history. February 17th, 1934. The sun rises over Belgium with the same indifference it always has. Workers pour into factories, shopkeepers unlock their doors. Children walk to school through streets still damp from the previous night's rain. And then the news arrives. It moves through telegraph wires and radio broadcasts, crackling into parlours and cafes, stopping conversations mid-sentence. Newspapers scramble to reprint their morning editions. The headline is simple, brutal, impossible. King Albert I is dead, not in his bed, not surrounded by family, not after a long illness that allowed the nation to prepare, dead at the base of a cliff, alone, his body broken on the rocks of Marche-les-Dames. The official explanation comes swiftly, a climbing accident. The king, an experienced mountaineer, had slipped during a solo ascent. A tragic mishap. Nothing more. But even as the government issues its statements, even as church bells toll across Brussels and citizens drape black cloth over their doorways, something else begins to spread through the country. Whispers, questions, doubt. Because kings do not simply die alone on cliffs. Not kings like Albert. Not men who had survived the trenches of the Great War, who had stared down artillery fire and poison gas, who had led their nation through its darkest hour. This is where our story begins, not with answers, but with a single, persistent question that refuses to fade even after 90 years. What really happened on that cliff? Chapter 1. The Soldier King. To understand why Albert's death sparked such immediate suspicion, you must first understand who Albert was. He was not a ceremonial figurehead content to wave from balconies and sign documents prepared by others. He was not a king who existed in comfortable distance from his people. Albert I was a soldier king. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Belgium found itself crushed between empires. German forces demanded passage through Belgian territory to strike at France. The Belgian government, small and militarily insignificant, faced an impossible choice. Step aside or be destroyed. They chose defiance, and Albert chose to fight alongside them. While other European monarchs observed the war from comfortable headquarters, Albert put on a uniform and went to the front. He stood in trenches, he toured field hospitals, he slept in the same conditions as his men. When Belgian forces made their desperate stand along the Yser River, holding a thin strip of unconquered territory, Albert was there. The photographs from that period show a man transformed. Gone was the formal royal portraiture of peacetime. Instead, you see Albert in mud-stained boots, studying maps by candlelight, his face lined with exhaustion that no amount of royal privilege could erase. His soldiers loved him for it. More importantly, the Belgian people loved him for it. When the war finally ended in 1918, Albert returned not just as a king, but as a national hero. He had shared in Belgium's suffering. He had refused to abandon his country even when the situation seemed hopeless. This was not a man who inspired casual devotion. This was a man who commanded genuine respect across class lines, political divisions, and even international borders. Foreign leaders took him seriously in ways they did not take other monarchs seriously. His opinions carried weight. His diplomatic interventions mattered. And that, as we will see, may have been precisely the problem, because influential men who refuse to follow expected scripts have a tendency to make powerful enemies. Albert had grown up in the shadow of his uncle, Leopold II, whose brutal exploitation of the Congo had stained Belgium's international reputation. When Albert ascended to the throne in 1909, He inherited not just a crown, but a moral burden. He worked quietly to reform colonial practices, though his efforts were limited by political realities and his own position within the system. But in Europe itself, Albert's reputation was untarnished. He was seen as progressive, thoughtful, genuinely concerned with the welfare of ordinary people. He supported social reforms. He advocated for workers' rights. He believed that monarchy could only survive in the modern age if it served the public good, rather than merely preserving its own privileges. These were not popular positions among Europe's traditional aristocracy. Many viewed Albert as naive, even dangerous. A king who sided with workers against factory owners, a monarch who questioned the divine right of the wealthy to exploit the poor. Such ideas threatened the entire social order. After the war, Albert's influence only grew. He had proven himself in the crucible of combat. He had earned moral authority that no amount of bloodline or ceremony could provide. When he spoke, people listened, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He used that influence carefully. He advocated for the League of Nations. He pushed for international cooperation and collective security. He believed that another war could be prevented if nations would talk to each other honestly rather than retreating into nationalism and military competition. But by the early 1930s, those hopes were fading. The League was proving ineffective. Germany was rearming. Extremist movements were gaining power across Europe. The lessons of the Great War were being forgotten with alarming speed. And Albert found himself increasingly isolated. His calls for moderation were dismissed as weakness. His warnings about resurgent militarism were ignored. His vision of a cooperative Europe was drowned out by the drums of nationalism. He was still respected, still influential, still beloved by ordinary Belgians, but among the political and military elite, among those who were positioning themselves for the coming conflict, Albert had become an obstacle, a problematic voice that needed to be marginalised, or silenced. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Independence. The 1920s and early 30s were not kind decades for Europe. The Great War had shattered old certainties. Empires had collapsed. New nations had emerged from the wreckage, their borders still contested, their governments still unstable, and everywhere, dangerous ideologies were gaining strength. Fascism was rising in Italy under Mussolini. National Socialism was taking root in Germany. Across the continent, movements that promised order through strength, unity through exclusion, and greatness through conquest were finding eager audiences. Belgium, small and vulnerable, sat at the crossroads of these brewing storms, and King Albert refused to pick a side in the way others wanted him to. He resisted the pull of extreme nationalism that was consuming other nations. He opposed unchecked military authority. He pushed back against political pressure from stronger European powers who wanted Belgium to align more closely with their interests. Instead, he favoured moderation, balance, diplomacy over confrontation. This made him extraordinarily popular with ordinary Belgians who had no appetite for more war, no desire to see their country become a battlefield again. But it made him inconvenient to others. Consider the Belgian political landscape in the early 1930s. The country was deeply divided between Catholics and secular liberals, between Flemish speakers and French speakers, between workers and industrialists. Coalition governments rose and fell with exhausting regularity. Political gridlock was common. In such an environment, a strong monarch could potentially break deadlocks, impose solutions, drive policy forward. Many politicians, particularly those on the right, wanted exactly that. They wanted Albert to use his popularity and moral authority to push through their preferred policies. But Albert refused. He believed in constitutional monarchy. He believed his role was to moderate, not to dominate. He would offer advice, express concerns, even apply gentle pressure. But he would not override the democratic process even when he found it frustrating. This restraint infuriated his critics. What was the point of having a popular king if he refused to actually use his power? Some began to wonder if Belgium might be better served by a different kind of monarch, someone more willing to act decisively, someone less constrained by democratic niceties. There were also military tensions. The Belgian army had been rebuilt after the Great War, but questions remained about its readiness and its doctrine. Some military leaders advocated for closer cooperation with France, effectively subordinating Belgian defence policy to French strategic interests. Albert resisted this. He believed Belgian independence required military autonomy. Yes, Belgium should work with France and Britain, but it should not become a mere adjunct to their military planning. This position put him at odds with influential voices in the military establishment. Officers who had served with French forces during the war, generals who believed that Belgian security depended on French protection. These men did not want a king who questioned their judgment. And then there were the foreign pressures. Nazi Germany was watching Belgium carefully. Hitler's regime was methodically identifying which nations might resist German expansion and which might be intimidated or seduced into cooperation. A strong, independent Belgium led by a king with moral authority and international respect was a problem for German ambitions. France, meanwhile, desperately wanted Belgium to commit to a firm military alliance. French strategists knew that if Germany attacked again, Belgium would be the invasion route. They needed Belgian cooperation, Belgian fortifications, Belgian willingness to coordinate defence plans. But Albert maintained Belgium's official neutrality. Not out of naivety, he understood the German threat perfectly well. But because he believed that explicitly choosing sides would only make Belgium a target, sooner. Britain had its own interests. British politicians worried about the balance of power on the continent. They wanted Belgium stable, defensible, but not so closely aligned with France that it might drag Britain into continental conflicts. All of these competing interests created a complex web of pressure around Albert. Every decision he made, every position he took pleased some parties and angered others. He was walking a tightrope, and tightrope walkers who lose their balance tend to fall. The question that conspiracy theorists ask is simple. Did Albert fall on his own, or was he pushed? Chapter 3. The Day He Went Alone, February 17th, 1934. Albert wakes early in the royal palace in Brussels. He has a light breakfast. He speaks briefly with Queen Elizabeth, though the content of their conversation is not recorded. Then he announces his intention. He is going to Marche-les-Dames. Marche-les-Dames is a limestone cliff formation along the Meuse River, about 50 miles southeast of Brussels. Albert knows it well. He has climbed there many times over the years. The rock faces there are challenging but not impossibly difficult for an experienced climber. And Albert, at 58 years old, is still active and healthy. He rides horses, he hikes, he maintains the physical fitness that served him during the war. But on this particular day, he makes a choice that will haunt every investigation that follows. He decides to climb alone. No guards accompany him, no aides, no climbing partners. This is not completely unusual. Albert values his privacy. He chafes at the constant presence of security personnel. Like many people in positions of power, he cherishes the rare moments when he can simply be himself, unobserved and unprotected. But it is also deeply unusual. Kings do not typically wander off alone to engage in dangerous activities. The protocols exist for a reason. The security details are not mere ceremony, yet Albert dismisses them all. According to later testimony, the palace staff expressed concern about his solo climb. The weather was acceptable but not ideal. Clouds were moving in, and there was a possibility of rain later in the day. Several people suggested that perhaps the king should wait for better conditions or at least take someone with him. Albert waved off these concerns. He had climbed in worse weather. He knew the route. He would be fine. This confidence would prove fatal. Or would it? Because here is where the conspiracy theories begin to take root. Why on this particular day did Albert insist so strongly on going alone? Was it simply his usual preference for privacy? Or had something changed? Some researchers have pointed to the political situation in the days leading up to February 17th. There had been tense discussions in Brussels about Belgium's foreign policy, disagreements about military readiness, friction between Albert and certain members of his government. Nothing explosive, nothing that made headlines. but a pattern of small conflicts that might have left Albert wanting to escape for a few hours, to clear his head, to be alone with his thoughts and the rock. This explanation makes psychological sense. Powerful people often seek solitude when they feel overwhelmed. The act of climbing, focusing entirely on the physical challenge, pushing everything else out of your mind, can be deeply therapeutic, but there is another possibility. What if Albert had received information that made him want to go somewhere he could not be overheard? What if he had arranged to meet someone at Marche-les-Dames? Someone he did not want palace staff to know about. This theory is more speculative, but it has some circumstantial support. A few witnesses reported seeing a second vehicle near the cliffs around the time Albert would have been climbing. The reports were vague and never confirmed, but they exist in the historical record. If Albert had arranged a clandestine meeting, it would explain his unusual insistence on going alone. It would explain why he chose that particular day despite questionable weather. And it would mean that he was not alone on the cliff, that someone else was there when he fell. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, we know only the facts. Albert drove to Marche-les-Dames. He parked his car near the base of the cliffs, and then he began his ascent. The route he chose was one he had climbed before, not the easiest path, but well within his capabilities. A series of ledges and handholds that required attention, but not extraordinary skill. The limestone rock of Marche-les-Dames is generally solid, though it can become slippery when wet. February is not the ideal climbing season. The rock is often damp from rain or morning frost, but experienced climbers can manage these conditions if they are careful. Was Albert careful that day? We have no way to know. What we know is that he climbed up the rock face, moving from hold to hold, working his way along the route he had followed in the past. And then, at some point during that climb, something went wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Albert fell. His body tumbled down the rock face, striking the limestone on the way down, finally coming to rest at the base of the cliff. The injuries were devastating. Multiple fractures, severe head trauma, internal bleeding. Death would have been quick, perhaps instantaneous. But what caused the fall? Did Albert simply make a mistake? Did he reach for a hold that was not secure? Did his foot slip on damp rock? Or did something else happen? Something that the official investigation would never adequately explore. Something that would leave room for 90 years of doubt. Chapter 4. The body at the base of the rocks. The search begins when Albert fails to arrive home at the expected time. Palace officials grow concerned. Calls are made. A small party is dispatched to Marche-les-Dames. They find his car, still parked near the cliffs, and then they find Albert. His body lies at the base of the rock face, broken and still. The injuries are severe, particularly to the head. Blood stains the rocks above where he fell, marking the trajectory of his descent. The scene tells a simple story. An experienced climber lost his grip or his footing. He fell. The impact killed him. There is no sign of struggle, no evidence of anyone else present, no indication of foul play. The authorities who arrive at the scene conduct a preliminary investigation. They photograph the body, they examine the rocks, they measure distances and angles, and they reach a conclusion that seems, on the surface, entirely reasonable. King Albert I died in a climbing accident. It is tragic. It is shocking. But it is, they assure the nation, straightforward. But let us pause here and examine what actually happened in those first crucial hours after Albert's body was discovered. The initial search party that found the king consisted of palace security personnel and local police. They were not forensic experts. They were not trained investigators. They were functionaries responding to an emergency. When they found Albert's body, they did what seemed natural. They moved him. They lifted him from the rocks, checked for signs of life, and when they found none, they prepared to transport him back to Brussels. In doing so, they contaminated the scene. Modern crime scene protocols would have demanded that nothing be touched until a full forensic team could document everything in place. Photographs from multiple angles, detailed measurements, careful preservation of any evidence. But in 1934, these protocols were not standard, and even if they had been, would they have been applied to a king's death that appeared to be an accident? The body was moved. The scene was disturbed. And whatever evidence might have existed beyond the obvious was lost. This is not necessarily suspicious. It reflects the standards of the time. But it does mean that questions which should have been answerable became permanently unanswerable. For instance, the blood on the rocks above Albert's body. The official explanation is that he struck these rocks on the way down, bleeding from the impact with the blood marking his path of descent. This makes sense. But could the blood pattern tell us anything else? Could it indicate whether Albert was conscious when he fell? Whether he tried to catch himself? Whether the fall was controlled or uncontrolled? We cannot know, because the scene was not preserved with sufficient detail. Consider another question. Albert's climbing equipment. What was he wearing? What gear did he have with him? Were there any signs that his equipment had failed or been tampered with? The initial reports mention that Albert was found with climbing equipment, but the specifics are vague. Later investigations tried to reconstruct what he had been carrying, but memory is unreliable and records from that chaotic first day are incomplete. If Albert's rope had been cut, or his carabiners tampered with, or his harness sabotaged, would anyone have noticed in the confusion of that afternoon? Probably not. And then there is the question of the fall itself. Based on where Albert's body was found and the blood on the rocks above, investigators concluded he had fallen from a height of approximately 80 feet. 80 feet is more than enough to cause fatal injuries. The official conclusion, that the fall killed him, is entirely plausible. But here is what is strange. Witnesses who saw the body described injuries that seemed excessive. Not just broken bones from impact, not just head trauma from striking rock, multiple fractures, severe crushing injuries. Trauma that seemed, to some observers, like more than a simple fall would cause. One person who saw the body, a palace physician who was not part of the official investigation, later wrote in his private diary that the king's injuries seemed curiously severe for the height of the fall. This observation was never followed up on. The physician was not called to testify. His diary remained private until it was published decades later. Could Albert's injuries tell us something important about how he died? Again, we cannot know. The body was not examined by a forensic pathologist. No autopsy was performed in accordance with modern standards. The official cause of death, massive trauma from a fall, was recorded based on visual examination alone, and then Albert's body was embalmed and prepared for the state funeral. Whatever evidence it might have contained was literally erased. This is not proof of conspiracy. Royal bodies are not typically subjected to detailed forensic analysis. The family has rights. Religious considerations apply. Political realities demand that the nation be allowed to mourn. But it does mean that questions which might have been answered definitively were, instead, left open to interpretation. And interpretation, in the absence of hard evidence, tends to drift towards suspicion. Chapter 5. Questions that would not fade. The conspiracy theories begin almost immediately. Some are wild and easily dismissed, tales of foreign assassins or elaborate plots that require technology and coordination that simply did not exist in 1934. But others are harder to ignore. They focus on the strangeness of the circumstances, the uncomfortable coincidences, the details that do not quite fit the neat narrative of a simple accident. Consider the timing. Albert had been in good health. There was no indication that his climbing abilities had deteriorated. The weather that day was unremarkable. No storm, no unusual conditions that would have made the ascent particularly dangerous. Consider his experience. This was not a novice attempting something beyond his skill level. Albert had been climbing for years. He knew Marche les Dames intimately. He understood the risks. Consider the politics. Albert had enemies, perhaps not enemies who would openly wish him dead, but certainly people who found his positions inconvenient. His resistance to certain political movements, his insistence on maintaining Belgian neutrality, his scepticism toward the militaristic nationalism spreading across Europe. What if someone wanted him gone? What if the cliff was not empty when Albert climbed it? What if someone was there, hidden, waiting? The theories branch in different directions from this central premise. The first major theory suggests equipment sabotage. Someone, identity unknown, gained access to Albert's climbing gear before the trip to Marsh-les-Dames. They weakened a rope, they damaged a carabiner, they compromised something in a way that would not be immediately visible, but would fail under stress. Albert would have begun his climb with no idea that his equipment had been sabotaged. He would have trusted the gear that had served him reliably in the past. And when he reached a critical point in the climb, the weakened equipment would have failed. He would have fallen, believing until the last moment that it was merely bad luck. This theory has a certain elegance. It explains why no one else needed to be present at the cliff. It explains why there would be no signs of struggle. The murder weapon would be the compromised equipment itself, which either was never recovered or was not examined closely enough to reveal the tampering. The main problem with this theory is that we have no detailed records of what equipment Albert was using that day. Without knowing the specifics, we cannot investigate whether sabotage was possible or likely. The second major theory is more direct. Albert was not alone on the cliff. Perhaps he had arranged to meet someone there. Perhaps someone had followed him without his knowledge. Perhaps an assassin had been waiting, hidden among the rocks. A confrontation occurs. Maybe just a startling encounter that causes Albert to lose his balance. Maybe something more violent. A push, a blow, a deliberate act of murder disguised as an accident. Albert falls. The killer flees. The scene, when discovered hours later, shows nothing but a body at the base of a cliff. This theory requires more assumptions. It requires that someone knew Albert would be at Marsh-les-Dames that day. It requires that they could approach or lie in wait without being seen. It requires that they could commit the act and escape without leaving evidence. But none of these requirements are impossible. If the assassin was a trained operative, and by 1934 every major European intelligence service had such operatives, they would have known how to follow a target without being detected. They would have known how to arrange what appeared to be an accident. They would have known how to leave a scene without leaving traces. The third theory focuses on what happened after Albert fell. Perhaps the fall itself was genuinely accidental, but perhaps someone was there when it happened, and perhaps that person, seeing an opportunity, chose not to help. Maybe Albert was injured, but not yet dead when he first struck the rocks. Maybe he could have been saved if someone had called for help immediately. But if that someone had reasons to want Albert dead, they might have simply watched, waited, let nature take its course. This theory is darker in some ways than outright murder. It suggests a cold calculation, a willingness to stand by while another human being dies, a betrayal that leaves no physical evidence because the killing weapon is simply time and neglect. And then there are the political theories, the ones that look beyond individual actors to systemic forces. Some researchers have suggested that Albert's death was not ordered by any one person, but was rather the result of a consensus among multiple parties, Belgian political factions, foreign intelligence, services, military leaders, industrial interests. Not a formal conspiracy with meetings and signed orders, but rather a shared understanding. Albert has become a problem. If something were to happen to him, we would not investigate too closely. This kind of diffuse conspiracy is harder to prove, but perhaps more realistic than tales of individual assassins. It requires no smoking gun because it operates through nods and implications rather than explicit commands. Someone arranges for security to be lax on a particular day. Someone ensures that Albert will be alone. Someone makes sure that the subsequent investigation will be brief and conclusory. No one person is responsible. Everyone has plausible deniability. But the result is the same. A king dies under suspicious circumstances, and the questions are never fully answered. These theories spread through Belgium like ripples on water. They cannot be stopped by official denials or rational explanations, because at their core they express something deeper than specific accusations. They express a fundamental distrust of the official narrative, a sense that the truth is being managed rather than revealed, and that distrust is fueled by one undeniable fact. Albert was alone when he died. There were no witnesses. No one can say with absolute certainty what happened on that cliff. The only person who knows the truth is dead. Chapter 6. The Rushed Investigation. Looking back through historical records, one detail stands out above all others. The investigation into Albert's death was remarkably brief. Within days, authorities had reached their conclusion. No extended forensic examination, no reconstruction of events, no exhaustive search for alternative explanations. The official report essentially confirmed what the initial scene assessment had suggested. Climbing accident. Case closed. The nation was urged to mourn, to remember Albert's service and sacrifice, to celebrate his legacy, but not to question. This. Speed raises its own set of questions. In 1934, forensic science was less advanced than today, but it was not non-existent. Techniques existed for analysing blood patterns, examining injuries, reconstructing falls. These methods could have been applied more thoroughly, but they were not. Why? The charitable explanation is that the evidence was simply too clear. The scene spoke for itself. There was no reason to prolong an investigation when the conclusion was obvious. But conspiracy theorists propose a different explanation. Speed was chosen to preserve stability rather than truth. Think about what a prolonged investigation would have meant for Belgium. Weeks or months of uncertainty while experts examined every possibility. Public speculation running wild. International attention focused on the question of whether the king had been murdered. For a small nation still recovering from one war and watching nervously as Europe prepared for another, such instability could have been catastrophic. Better perhaps to declare it an accident quickly. To give the nation a clear narrative they could process and move beyond. To avoid the chaos that would come from admitting that the death might be suspicious. This is not necessarily evidence of conspiracy. It could simply be pragmatic governance, choosing social stability over absolute investigative thoroughness. But it left the door open. It left room for doubt to take root and grow. Let us examine exactly what the official investigation entailed. A commission was assembled consisting of government officials, military officers, and one forensic consultant. They reviewed the photographs taken at the scene. They interviewed the people who had found Albert's body. They examined the limited physical evidence that had been preserved. Their work took 3 days. 3 days to investigate the death of a king. Compare this to modern standards, where deaths under even mildly suspicious circumstances can trigger investigations lasting months or years, where forensic teams spend days just documenting a single crime scene, where every possible theory is explored and either confirmed or ruled out through careful analysis. The Commission in 1934 did none of this. They accepted the most obvious explanation and moved on. Their official report ran to just 16 pages. Much of it was devoted to Albert's biography and his service to the nation. The actual investigation of his death occupied perhaps 4 pages. Those 4 pages contain almost no technical analysis, no discussion of fall mechanics, no examination of whether the injuries were consistent with an accidental fall versus other causes, no exploration of alternative scenarios, just a simple narrative. Albert climbed, Albert fell, Albert died. When the report was published, most Belgians accepted it. They wanted to believe it was an accident. They needed to believe it. The alternative, that their beloved king had been murdered, was too painful to contemplate. But some people immediately recognised what was missing from the report. A Belgian journalist named Henri Jaspard wrote a series of articles questioning the investigation's thoroughness. He did not accuse anyone of conspiracy. He simply asked, "How can we be certain this was an accident when so little investigation was conducted?" Jaspard's articles were controversial. He was accused of disrespecting the king's memory. Some publications refused to run his pieces. He received threats. But his core argument was sound. The investigation was insufficient to rule out other possibilities. Jaspard pointed out specific gaps in the official report. No timeline of Albert's movements that day. The report stated he arrived at Mash-le-Dam in the morning but did not specify when. No investigation into whether anyone else had been in the area. No technical analysis of the climbing route. The report mentioned which cliff face Albert had climbed but did not examine whether that route presented unusual hazards that day. No detailed examination of Albert's equipment. The report noted he had appropriate climbing gear, but did not inventory it or inspect it for defects. No autopsy. The report stated the cause of death was massive trauma, but did not break down the specific injuries or analyse whether they were consistent with a simple fall. No exploration of alternative scenarios. The report did not even acknowledge that assassination was a theoretical possibility worth investigating. Jasper argued that even if the conclusion was correct, even if Albert's death was genuinely an accident, the investigation should have been more thorough. A king had died. The nation deserved a comprehensive accounting of what happened. His articles had some impact. They kept the questions alive in public discourse. They prevented the official narrative from being accepted without criticism, but they did not lead to any reopening of the investigation. The government's position was clear. The case is closed. Albert died in a climbing accident. Further investigation would serve no purpose except to fuel speculation and disturb the nation's grieving process. And so, the questions remained unanswered. Not because anyone could prove the official story was false, but because no one had done the work necessary to prove it was true. In the absence of that proof, doubt flourished. Chapter 7. Who benefited from his death? In any suspicious death, investigators ask a fundamental question: who benefited? In Albert's case, the answer is uncomfortable but undeniable. Several people and political factions had reason to welcome his absence. Albert's successor was his son, Leopold III. While Leopold would eventually face his own controversies, particularly regarding his actions during the Second World War, he was initially seen as more conventional than his father, more willing to work within established political frameworks, less inclined to assert royal independence against government pressure. For those who had found Albert frustrating, Leopold represented a fresh start, a monarch who might be more cooperative. But the question of succession goes deeper than just the difference between father and son. There were people in Belgium, powerful people, who believed the monarchy needed to be either strengthened or weakened, depending on their political perspective. Albert's moderate approach satisfied no one. Conservatives wanted a strong monarch who would push through right-wing policies. They were disappointed by Albert's constitutional restraint. Liberals wanted a purely ceremonial monarchy that stayed out of politics entirely. They were frustrated by Albert's willingness to express opinions and exert influence. Leopold, as a younger and less established monarch, might be more easily moulded to either vision. His inexperience could be an asset to whoever got to him first. Consider the Catholic Party, which dominated Belgian politics in the early 1930s. Albert had complex relationships with Catholic leaders. He was personally religious, but he opposed using religion as a political weapon. He supported social reforms that the church found threatening. The party leadership had grown tired of negotiating with a king who had his own strong opinions. They wanted a monarch who would support their agenda more reliably. Leopold, they hoped, might be that monarch. Consider the Belgian military establishment. Albert had resisted their calls for accelerated rearmament. He had questioned their strategic plans. He had insisted on maintaining political control over military affairs. Senior officers chafed under his scepticism. They believed Belgium needed a more martial monarchy, someone who would rubber-stamp military budgets and defer to professional military judgment. Again, Leopold seemed like he might be more accommodating. Consider Belgian industrialists. Albert had supported labour reforms. He had pushed for better working conditions and higher wages. He had sided with unions in several major disputes. Factory owners and business leaders found this intolerable. They wanted a monarch who understood that Belgium's prosperity depended on maintaining industrial competitiveness, even if that meant keeping labour costs down. Would Leopold share his father's sympathies for workers, or would he be more receptive to business interests? They hoped for the latter. Beyond these domestic considerations, there were international factors. France desperately wanted Belgium to commit to a formal military alliance. French strategic planning in the 1930s was built around the assumption that if Germany attacked, Belgium would fight alongside France from the beginning. But Albert had resisted such commitments. He believed they would make Belgium a target and eliminate any possibility of genuine neutrality. French politicians and military leaders found this position infuriating. They needed Belgian cooperation. They needed access to Belgian territory for defensive purposes. They needed Belgium to coordinate military planning with France. Albert was the main obstacle to getting what they wanted. With Albert gone, perhaps Leopold could be persuaded to take a different approach. Nazi Germany, meanwhile, had its own calculations. Hitler's regime was carefully assessing which European nations would resist German expansion, and which might be intimidated into accommodation. A Belgium led by the Soldier King, a man who had proven his courage under fire, who commanded genuine popular support, who had the moral authority to rally national resistance, was a significant problem for German plans. A Belgium led by an untested new king might be more susceptible to pressure. And then there were the intelligence services. By 1934, espionage and covert action had become standard tools of statecraft. Every major power had networks of agents gathering information and conducting operations. Did any of these agencies target Albert? We have no direct evidence. Intelligence files from that era remain mostly classified. But we can make informed speculation based on what we know about how these agencies operated. The German Abwehr, military intelligence, would certainly have been interested in Albert. He was a potential military leader in any future conflict. Understanding his thinking, his plans, his vulnerabilities would have been a priority. The French Deuxième Bureau would have had similar interests. They would have wanted to know whether Albert could be influenced, pressured, or if necessary, removed. Even British intelligence, MI6 and its various predecessors, would have maintained files on Albert. Britain had a long history of involvement in Belgian affairs. They would have wanted to ensure that Belgium remained stable and aligned with British interests. None of this proves that any intelligence service was involved in Albert's death, but it establishes that multiple agencies had both the motive and the capability to arrange such an operation if they deemed it necessary. And the method, staging a climbing accident, would have been well within the capabilities of trained operatives. So we return to the fundamental question, who benefited? The answer is, many people, many factions, many interests, and that is precisely what makes the conspiracy theories so durable. If only one person had a motive, it would be easier to investigate and either confirm or disprove their involvement. But when numerous parties all had reason to want Albert gone, when the beneficiaries of his death span the political spectrum and cross international borders, the conspiracy becomes impossible to trace back to any single source. It becomes, in a sense, self-executing. Everyone understood that Albert was a problem. No one needed to explicitly order his death. They just needed to create conditions where such a death could occur and would not be investigated too closely. Is this what happened? We cannot know for certain, but we can observe that Albert's death solved problems for many powerful people. And we can note that those people showed remarkably little curiosity about exactly how those problems came to be solved. Chapter 8. Foreign Shadows. Some theories about Albert's death look beyond Belgium's borders entirely. They point to the broader European context of 1934. The continent was a powder keg. Germany was rearming under Hitler. Italy was pursuing aggressive expansion. The Soviet Union was locked in Stalin's purges. Spain was sliding toward civil war. Everywhere, intelligence services were operating with increasing aggression. Assassination was not theoretical. It was a tool of statecraft. Albert, with his commitment to Belgian neutrality and his resistance to extremism, represented a problem for multiple foreign powers. Let us examine each of these foreign interests more carefully. Nazi Germany is perhaps the most obvious suspect in conspiracy theories. By 1934, Hitler had been in power for just over a year. The Nazi regime was still consolidating control, but its ambitions were already clear. Hitler's strategic vision required German dominance over Central and Western Europe. Belgium, with its strategic location and its access to ports on the English Channel, would be crucial in any conflict with France and Britain. Albert was a known enemy of fascism. He had made no secret of his disgust with Nazi racial ideology. In private conversations, he had expressed deep concerns about Hitler's regime and its implications for European stability. If Germany went to war, Albert would certainly lead Belgian resistance. His experience, his popularity, his military credibility, all of these would make him a formidable opponent. Better, perhaps, to remove him before the war began. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had the capability to conduct such an operation. They had agents throughout Europe. They had experience with covert operations. They had the technical expertise to stage convincing accidents. But would they have taken such a risk in 1934? Germany was not yet strong enough to fight a major war. Hitler was still cautious about provoking international opposition. Would he have authorised the assassination of a foreign monarch? Possibly not through official channels, but the Nazi regime was not monolithic. Various factions pursued their own agendas. Rogue elements within the intelligence services might have acted without explicit authorization if they believed it served German interests. And crucially, if such an operation were discovered, Hitler could plausibly deny any knowledge of it. France presents a different kind of suspicion. The French did not want Albert dead. They needed Belgium as an ally. But they wanted him to be more cooperative, more willing to subordinate Belgian interests to French strategic needs. What if a French intelligence operation went wrong? Imagine this scenario. French agents approach Albert at Marche-les-Dames. Perhaps they have information to share. Perhaps they want to have a private conversation away from official channels. The meeting becomes confrontational. Albert refuses whatever they are demanding. Threats are made. The situation escalates. And suddenly, there is a death that no one intended but that everyone must now cover up. This theory explains several puzzling elements. It explains why Albert might have gone to the cliff alone. If he were meeting French agents, he would not want Belgian security personnel present. It explains the rushed investigation. If French intelligence were involved, both the French and Belgian governments would want to bury the truth to avoid an international incident. It explains why there were rumours of a second vehicle at the cliff that day, French agents arriving for the meeting, and it explains why the conspiracy theories focus on accident versus assassination, rather than considering the possibility of something in between, a death that was neither planned murder nor simple accident, but rather the catastrophic outcome of an intelligence operation that went horribly wrong. Britain had its own intelligence interests in Belgium. MI6 maintained extensive operations on the continent, gathering information on both allies and potential enemies. British interests were more aligned with Albert's positions than those of Germany or even France. Britain wanted Belgium stable, independent, and capable of resisting German expansion if necessary. But British intelligence also had a reputation for ruthless pragmatism. If they believed that Albert had become unstable, unpredictable, or susceptible to German influence, they might have considered him a security risk. The British method would have been subtler than German or French approaches, not a direct assassination, but perhaps pressure or manipulation that created conditions for an accident to occur. This is the darkest version of the conspiracy theory, the idea that Albert's death was not murdered by any one party, but was rather the result of multiple intelligence services all working to create vulnerability. One service provides information about Albert's movements, another arranges for security to be absent, a third ensures that anyone who might witness something is elsewhere that day. No one orders the death explicitly. But everyone understands that if something were to happen, it would not be unwelcome. And then there is the Soviet Union. Stalin's regime had its own reasons to monitor European monarchies. The Soviets wanted to destabilize Western Europe. They wanted to create conditions favourable to communist revolution. They wanted to eliminate figures who might rally anti-communist resistance. Albert was exactly such a figure. His combination of personal courage, political moderation and popular support made him dangerous to Soviet interests. Soviet intelligence, the NKVD, was conducting operations throughout Europe in the 1930s. They had assassinated numerous targets, including political figures who opposed Stalin's interests. Would they have targeted a Belgian king? It seems less likely than German or French involvement, simply because Soviet interests in Belgium were less direct. But it cannot be entirely ruled out. And here is the unsettling reality. In an era when multiple intelligence services were conducting covert operations across Europe, when assassination was a standard tool of statecraft, when moral restraints on such actions had eroded, the question is not whether foreign powers could have arranged Albert's death. The question is whether they chose to. And we may never know the answer, because intelligence operations by their nature leave no paper trail. Files are destroyed. Witnesses die or remain silent. Deniability is built into every stage of the operation. If a foreign intelligence service did target Albert, the evidence was buried 90 years ago. All that remains is suspicion, and the undeniable fact that Albert died under circumstances that would have been entirely consistent with a professional assassination made to look like an accident. Chapter 9. Modern forensics revisit the scene. Decades after Albert's death, forensic experts were given access to preserved evidence from the original investigation. Using modern techniques unavailable in 1934, they conducted a new analysis. They examined photographs of the scene, they studied reports of the injuries, they analysed the blood patterns on the rocks. Their conclusion: the evidence is consistent with a fall. The injuries Albert sustained match what would be expected from a climber losing his grip and falling roughly 80 feet onto limestone. The blood on the rocks above shows a trajectory consistent with impact during the descent. There is no evidence in the physical record that contradicts the accident explanation. No signs of struggle, no injuries inconsistent with a fall, no indication that the scene was tampered with. For many people, this modern forensic analysis settles the question. The experts have spoken, the science is clear. Albert died in a climbing accident just as the original investigation concluded. The conspiracy theories can finally be put to rest. But they are not put to rest, because forensic evidence can only tell us what happened to Albert's body. It cannot tell us why it happened. Let us examine what the modern forensic analysis actually revealed, and what it could not reveal. The analysis was conducted in 1973, nearly 40 years after Albert's death. A team of forensic pathologists reviewed all available documentation from the original investigation. They noted that the quality of evidence preservation was poor by modern standards. Photographs were limited. Physical evidence had not been properly stored. The body itself had been embalmed and buried decades earlier, making direct examination impossible. But they worked with what they had. Their analysis of the injury patterns was thorough. Based on the descriptions in the original reports and the limited photographic evidence, they concluded that Albert had sustained multiple fractures to the skull, consistent with high-impact trauma, broken ribs and damage to internal organs, fractures to the arms and legs, suggesting he had struck multiple surfaces during the fall, severe abrasions and contusions throughout the body. All of these injuries, the forensic team concluded, were consistent with a fall of approximately 80 feet onto irregular rock surfaces. The blood pattern analysis was particularly interesting. The team noted that blood had been found on rocks at various heights, above where Albert's body was discovered. This suggested he had struck the cliff face multiple times on the way down, bleeding from head injuries sustained early in the fall. The distribution of blood was consistent with an uncontrolled tumbling fall, rather than a straight vertical drop. Again, this supported the accident theory. If Albert had been pushed or struck, you might expect a more direct trajectory. The tumbling patterns suggested he had simply lost his grip and fallen. The forensic team's report concluded with a statement that seemed definitive. Based on available evidence, the injury patterns and physical findings are entirely consistent with an accidental fall. We find no evidence that would suggest alternative causes of death. For the Belgian government, this was vindication. The original investigation had been correct. Albert's death was an accident. The conspiracy theories were unfounded, but conspiracy theorists were not convinced. They pointed out what the forensic analysis could not determine. It could not tell whether Albert's climbing equipment had been sabotaged. The equipment itself had not been preserved for analysis. Even if it had been, after 40 years, determining whether damage was deliberate or accidental would be nearly impossible. It could not tell whether Albert had been startled or distracted immediately before his fall. A sudden shout, an unexpected presence, a deliberate attempt to make him lose his balance. None of these would leave traces in the physical evidence. It could not tell whether Albert had been injured before he fell, if someone had struck him, causing disorientation or unconsciousness, and then pushed him over the edge. The injuries from the subsequent fall would obscure any prior trauma. It could not tell whether the scene had been staged, if someone had been present when Albert fell and had arranged the body or cleaned up evidence of their presence. The forensic analysis would have no way to detect this decades later. In short, the forensic analysis confirmed that Albert died from a fall, but it could not confirm that the fall was accidental. This distinction is crucial. The forensic evidence rules out certain wild theories. Albert was not shot and then placed at the base of the cliff. He was not killed elsewhere and his body transported to Marsh-les-Dames. He actually fell from that rock face. But within the category of death by falling from a rock face, there remain multiple possibilities. Pure accident. Albert made a mistake and fell. Induced accident. Someone created conditions that made Albert fall. Disguised murder. Albert was killed and then made to fall. The forensic evidence cannot distinguish between these scenarios, and so the conspiracy endures, adapting to accommodate the forensic findings rather than being disproven by them. Conspiracy theorists now argue that the modern forensic analysis actually supports their case. It proves that if Albert was murdered, the killers were sophisticated enough to leave no obvious traces. It demonstrates that a professional assassination could indeed be made to look exactly like an accident. This is the nature of conspiracy theories involving deaths without witnesses. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of cover-up. The lack of proof becomes proof of how well the plot was executed. You cannot forensically analyse what you cannot observe, and no one observed what happened on that cliff. Chapter 10. Why the Theory Endures. 90 years have passed since Albert fell at Marsh-les-Dames. 90 years of investigation, analysis, debate, and research. 90 years in which no definitive proof of conspiracy has emerged, and yet the theory persists. Why? The answer lies not in evidence but in psychology, in the way human minds process uncertain information, in the way we construct narratives to make sense of events that disturb us. Let us examine the elements that make Albert's death such fertile ground for conspiracy theories. First, the victim himself. Albert was not an ordinary person. He was a king. He was a war hero. He was beloved by his people. His death was not just the loss of an individual, but the loss of a symbol. When important people die suddenly, we struggle to accept that their death could be meaningless. We want their death to matter, to have significance, to be part of some larger story. A simple climbing accident seems too small, too random, too insignificant to explain the death of a king. Conspiracy provides a more satisfying narrative. It makes Albert's death consequential. It suggests he was important enough, threatening enough, significant enough that powerful forces felt compelled to eliminate him. In a perverse way, conspiracy theories honour Albert by refusing to believe he could have died from mere bad luck. Second, the circumstances. Albert died alone. This single fact is perhaps the most important factor in sustaining conspiracy theories. If there had been witnesses, even one person watching from below, the doubt would be far less. A witness could testify to what happened, could confirm that no one else was present, could describe the moment of the fall. But Albert was alone, and lone deaths are inherently suspicious. They leave room for imagination. They cannot be corroborated. They exist in a narrative void that the human mind rushes to fill. Consider how different the historical record would be if Albert had been climbing with a companion. If someone had been there to say, "I saw him reach for a handhold. I saw it break away. I saw him fall. There was no one else there. It was an accident." That testimony, even if not entirely conclusive, would have carried weight. It would have provided a counter-narrative to conspiracy theories. But there was no such witness, so we are left with an empty space where testimony should be. And into that empty space, conspiracy theorists pour their suspicions. Third, the political context. Albert died at a moment of extraordinary tension in European history. The 1930s were a decade of crisis. of collapsing democracies and rising dictatorships, of preparations for war. In such a context, assassination seems not just possible, but probable. We know that political murders were common in the 1930s. We know that intelligence services were operating with minimal restraint. We know that moral boundaries that might have prevented such actions in earlier eras had broken down. So when conspiracy theorists suggest that Albert might have been murdered, they are not proposing something outlandish. They are proposing something that would have been entirely consistent with the practices of the time. This makes the conspiracy theory more plausible than it might be in a different historical context. If Albert had died in the same way in, say, 1900, the conspiracy theories would be easier to dismiss. International relations were governed by different norms then. The idea of a European power assassinating another nation's monarch would have seemed outrageous, but in 1934, less outrageous, more believable. Fourth, the investigation. The speed and superficiality of the official investigation feeds conspiracy theories in an obvious way. When authorities rush to a conclusion, it suggests they do not want to find certain answers. When investigations are incomplete, it suggests someone does not want the truth to be known. Whether this interpretation is fair or not, it is understandable. A thorough investigation that explored every possibility and then concluded accident would have been far more credible than a brief investigation that accepted the most obvious explanation without serious scrutiny. The Belgian government's apparent eagerness to close the case quickly and move on raises questions. Even if their motives were benign, even if they genuinely believed further investigation would serve no purpose, the optics are bad. It looks like a cover-up, and when something looks like a cover-up, people will believe it is a cover-up regardless of the actual facts. Fifth, the beneficiaries. The fact that multiple parties benefited from Albert's death creates a kind of conspiracy multiplication effect. If only one person or group stood to gain, that would focus suspicion in a specific direction. Investigators could examine that party's actions, their capability, their opportunity. But when many different parties all benefited, when Albert's death solved problems for Belgian politicians, military leaders, foreign governments, and intelligence services, the conspiracy becomes diffuse. It could have been anyone, or it could have been a coordination among several parties, or it could have been simply that everyone understood what needed to happen and someone took action. This diffusion makes the conspiracy impossible to trace, but also, paradoxically, more believable. The multiplicity of suspects becomes evidence that something must have happened. Surely all these people who benefited cannot have benefited purely by chance. Sixth, human psychology. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We see connections even where none exist. We construct narratives to explain random events. We struggle to accept that important outcomes can have trivial causes. The death of a king from a simple misstep while climbing. It seems wrong somehow. Disproportionate. Unsatisfying. A conspiracy to assassinate a king who stood in the way of powerful forces. That feels right. It feels proportionate. It feels like it makes sense. This is not a logical judgment. It is an emotional one. But emotional judgments are powerful. They shape how we interpret evidence, how we weigh possibilities, how we construct our understanding of the world, and finally, the endurance of doubt. Once a conspiracy theory takes root, it is extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. Proof of the conspiracy would confirm it. But absence of proof is interpreted as evidence of an effective cover-up. New evidence that supports the official narrative is dismissed as part of the conspiracy. New evidence that contradicts the official narrative is celebrated as vindication. The theory becomes self-sealing. It cannot be disproven because any attempt to disprove it is interpreted as further evidence of its truth. This is frustrating for those who believe in the power of evidence and rational inquiry, but it is a reality of how human belief systems function. People do not just believe in conspiracy theories because of evidence. They believe because the conspiracy theory fulfills psychological needs. It makes the world feel more comprehensible, more controlled, more meaningful than it actually is. And so, 90 years after Albert's death, the conspiracy theories persist, not because new evidence has emerged, but because the old questions were never adequately answered. and once doubt takes root, it grows like a weed, spreading through the cracks in the official narrative, impossible to fully eradicate. Epilogue. The quiet cliff. Today, Marsh-les-Dames stands silent. The limestone cliffs remain unchanged, weathered by 9 decades of wind and rain, but essentially the same as they were on that February day in 1934. Climbers still visit the site. Some come for the challenge of the rock face. Others come because they know the history, drawn by the same dark fascination that pulls people to famous death sites around the world. There is a memorial near where Albert fell, a simple marker acknowledging his passing. Tourists occasionally stop to read it, take photographs and move on. The official history books record an accident, an experienced climber who made a fatal mistake, a tragic end to a remarkable life. The conspiracy theories record something else, a question that refuses to die, a possibility that cannot be definitively ruled out. Who is right? After 90 years, we still cannot say with absolute certainty. The forensic evidence supports the accident conclusion. The lack of witnesses makes alternative explanations impossible to prove or disprove. We are left with a choice about what to believe, based not on definitive proof but on our assessment of probability, context and trust. Perhaps Albert simply fell. Perhaps age and fatigue and bad luck converged in a single moment to end his life. Perhaps someone ensured that he fell. Perhaps political calculation and opportunity and ruthlessness combined to create murder disguised as accident. We will likely never know, but we can observe this. When powerful men die alone, history closes the file with efficient speed, and doubt keeps reading between the lines. What we do know is this: Albert was a man who stood in the way of powerful forces. He resisted nationalism when nationalism was ascendant. He opposed militarism when militarism was fashionable. He insisted on independence when independence was inconvenient, and then he died. Alone, under circumstances that could have been accidental, but could also have been arranged. The investigation that followed was brief, incomplete, and eager to reach a conclusion that would allow the nation to move forward. No one with the power to demand answers chose to do so. The beneficiaries of his death inherited a more pliable monarch and a more convenient political situation. And 90 years of inquiry have failed to prove either that it was murder or that it was not. This is the nature of unsolved mysteries. They do not disappear. They merely age, accumulating layers of interpretation and speculation, becoming less about the actual event and more about what the event represents. Albert's death represents the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals. It represents the ease with which truth can be obscured when authorities choose speed over thoroughness. It represents the way political convenience can override the search for justice. Whether or not Albert was actually murdered, the suspicion that he might have been tells us something important about the world he lived in. It was a world where such murders were common, where intelligence services operated without meaningful oversight, where assassination was a tool of statecraft, employed routinely against targets deemed inconvenient. In that world, the death of a Belgian king on a cliff could easily have been more than an accident, and the fact that we can still believe this 90 years later is perhaps the most damning evidence of all, not of conspiracy, but of the system that made conspiracy believable. The cliff at Marsh-les-Dames holds its secret still. The rocks remember nothing. The wind carries no confession. And King Albert I, the soldier king who survived the trenches of the Great War only to fall from a familiar cliff, remains suspended between history and mystery, between accident and assassination, between what was recorded and what might have been true. His death reminds us that some questions outlive the people who could answer them, and that sometimes the most important historical truth is not what happened, but that we can never be certain. The investigation is closed, the conspiracy continues, and Marsh-les-Dames stands silent, holding whatever truth lies buried in its ancient stone. If you climb there today, on a quiet morning when the mist hangs low over the Meuse River, you might understand why this place has captured imaginations for so long. The cliffs are beautiful but unforgiving. The rock is solid but treacherous. The view from the heights is spectacular, but the drop is fatal. It is easy to imagine how an experienced climber could make a single mistake and pay for it with his life. It is equally easy to imagine how a killer could arrange such a death and walk away leaving no traces. Both narratives fit the landscape perfectly, and that is why the mystery endures. Because Marche-les-Dames is a place where both accident and murder seem equally plausible, where the line between tragic mishap and calculated assassination becomes impossibly thin. Standing at the base of those cliffs, looking up at the route Albert climbed on his last day, you realise that the truth might be buried not in documents or testimony, but in the rock itself, and the rock will never speak. So we are left with our questions and our suspicions and our competing narratives. We are left with the uncomfortable knowledge that powerful people sometimes die under suspicious circumstances, and that the truth about their deaths is not always meant to be found. We are left with King Albert I, forever falling through history, his death observed by no one, his final moments known only to himself and perhaps to whoever, or whatever, caused him to fall. The story of his death is not really about climbing or cliffs or forensic evidence. It is about power and its vulnerabilities. It is about truth and how easily it can be buried. It is about the questions that persist when answers are denied. And it is about the fact that sometimes, in the space between what we know and what we can prove, doubt takes root and grows into something that can never be fully killed. King Albert I climbed alone to Marche-les-Dames on a February morning in 1934. He did not return. Everything else is interpretation, and after 90 years, the interpretation continues. The coffee cup trembles in my weathered hands as I speak these words for the first time in 53 years. My name is Detective Raymond Kowalski, retired SFPD, and I'm dying. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. But luck ran out for me the day I opened that damned Alcatraz file. They said Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The FBI closed the case. The warden slept easy. America's most infamous prison maintained its perfect record. But I found things I was never meant to see. Things that made me understand why some truths are buried deeper than bodies. This is my confession. Not of crimes I committed, but of the crime I witnessed. The systematic erasure of 3 men who may have pulled off the impossible, only to disappear into something far worse than death. If you're listening to this recording, it means I'm gone, and maybe, just maybe, the truth can finally surface from the depths where it's been drowning all these years. It was October 1968 when Lieutenant Carson dropped the manila folder on my desk like it was radioactive. 6 years had passed since the escape, and the case was supposedly closed, filed away with all the other solved mysteries that kept the bureaucrats sleeping soundly. "Formality, Kowalski," Carson said, not meeting my eyes. "Washington wants a final review of the Alcatraz evidence. Dot the I's, cross the T's, confirm what we already know. They're fish food at the bottom of the bay." I should have known something was wrong by the way he said it. Carson was a straight shooter, the kind of cop who looked you in the eye when he talked. But that day, he stared at the wall behind me like the words might crawl off it and bite him. The file was thinner than I expected for the most famous prison break in American history. Basic escape details, witness statements from guards, the makeshift raft materials found on Angel Island. Nothing I hadn't read in the newspapers. Too clean, too neat. "Why me?" I asked. Carson finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Because you're thorough, maybe too thorough. They want this done right." He left me with those cryptic words and a growing certainty that this formality was anything but routine. I started with the obvious inconsistencies. The first was a car theft report from Marina District, filed 3 days after the escape. A 1959 Chevrolet, stolen from outside a boarding house. The owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, told police she saw 3 men walking away from the vehicle, heading toward the waterfront. When she called out to them, one turned and tipped his hat. "Polite as you please." "They had manners," she told the responding officer. "Real gentlemen. You don't expect that from criminals." The report was buried on page 47 of miscellaneous incident files. No follow-up, no investigation, no mention in the official Alcatraz case summary. Then there was the paddle, a crude wooden oar carved from driftwood, found by a fisherman near Richmond Bridge, 20 miles upriver from where the currents should have carried any debris. The fisherman, Miguel Santos, reported it to park rangers, who logged it as miscellaneous beach debris. No connection made to the escape, despite the timing and craftsmanship that clearly showed prison workshop techniques. But it was the witness statement that made my blood run cold. A night security guard at Fisherman's Wharf reported seeing 3 men in work clothes boarding a small fishing boat around 4 a.m. on June 12th. One of them had distinctive ears, prominent, almost pointed, just like John Anglin's mugshot description. The guard's statement was taken, filed, and apparently forgotten. When I tried to interview him, I learned he'd quit his job 2 weeks after the incident and moved back to Oregon. No forwarding address. "Don't dig too deep on this one, Ray," Carson warned me when I briefed him on my preliminary findings. "Some stones are better left unturned." That's when I knew I was onto something bigger than a prison break. The Anglin family farm in Ruskin, Florida felt like stepping into a different century. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the humid air carried the scent of orange blossoms and old secrets. Robert Anglin, the surviving brother, met me on the front porch with the wary eyes of a man who'd been expecting bad news for 6 years. "Federal agents been by here 4 times, he said without preamble, each time asking the same questions, getting the same answers. "My brother's drowned. That's what you want to hear, ain't it?" But his wife, Marie, had different ideas. After Robert went to tend the cattle, she pulled me aside in her kitchen, glancing nervously at the windows. "Christmas cards," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. "Every year since '63, no return address, just signed J&C in handwriting that looks mighty familiar." She showed me a shoebox filled with holiday cards, generic drugstore variety, postmarked from different cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Mexico City. The handwriting was careful, disguised, but there were telltale loops and slants that matched samples I'd obtained from the prison records. "Why haven't you told the FBI?" I asked. Marie's laugh was bitter. "You think we haven't tried? First agent said they were hoaxes. Second one confiscated them as evidence. Third one threatened to charge us with obstruction if we kept spreading false hope. These here are copies I made before they took the originals." Photographs came out next. 3 pictures, slightly blurry, showing 2 men in work shirts standing outside what appeared to be a South American cantina. The faces were partially obscured by shadows and hat brims, but the bone structure, the posture, the way one man favoured his left leg, it all matched the Anglin brothers' physical profiles. Woman from church. Her daughter married a missionary, sent these from Brazil in '65, Marie explained. Said these 2 Americans worked construction jobs, paid cash, kept to themselves, spoke English with Florida accents. I studied the photos with a magnifying glass. The man on the left had a distinctive scar on his forearm, a scar I remembered from Clarence Anglin's prison medical records, sustained in a workshop accident at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. "FBI says they're look-alikes," Marie continued. "Coincidence, but a mother knows her son's detective. Even in shadows, even across oceans, those are my boys." The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of grief or false hope. It was the fear of someone who knew more than she was saying, someone who'd been warned to keep quiet. As I left the farm that evening, I noticed a dark sedan parked down the country road, 2 figures visible in the front seats. When I drove past, they turned away, but not before I caught a glimpse of federal license plates. The Anglins were being watched. After 6 years, the dead men's family was still under surveillance. That night in my motel room, I spread out everything I'd gathered so far. The car theft, the paddle, the witness statements, the cards and photographs. Individually, they could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. Together, they painted a picture that made my hands shake as I wrote my preliminary report. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't drowned in San Francisco Bay. They'd made it to shore, stolen transportation, and somehow managed to disappear into the wind. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether they'd survived the escape. It was why the government was so determined to pretend they hadn't. The National Archives building in Washington, D.C. has the kind of institutional grandeur designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As I walked through its marble corridors in November 1968, carrying my credentials and a growing list of questions, I felt exactly as intended. The records clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the pallor of someone who spent his days in basement filing rooms, greeted my request with practiced bureaucratic indifference. Alcatraz escape files? Let me check the catalogue. He disappeared into the labyrinthine storage system, returning 20 minutes later with a puzzled frown. That's odd. The primary files show as transferred to federal custody in 1964, no longer available for review. Transferred where? Doesn't say. Just lists the authorization code. Project Paperclip Archive classified. Project Paperclip. Even a street cop from San Francisco knew that designation. The program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II. Why would an escape case be filed under intelligence classifications? What about the secondary files, witness statements, evidence logs? Another search, another apologetic shrug. Also transferred, same authorization. I spent 3 days in Washington, following leads that turned to smoke and asking questions that generated only nervous silence. At FBI headquarters, my request for case consultation was politely denied. At the Bureau of Prisons, I was told the relevant personnel were unavailable for comment. Even my police credentials and Lieutenant Carson's authorization letters seemed to carry no weight. It was Agent Patricia Hendricks, a bureau analyst I'd worked with on a previous case, who finally gave me the truth over drinks in a Georgetown bar. She waited until we were alone, until the other patrons had cleared out, until even the bartender was busy with inventory in the back room. "Ray, you need to drop this," she said quietly, her usual professional demeanour replaced by genuine concern. "The Alcatraz case isn't cold. It's radioactive." "What does that mean?" Patricia glanced around the empty bar before continuing. Internal memo came down in 65. Any agent pursuing Alcatraz leads beyond the official drowning conclusion would be transferred to Alaska or worse. 3 agents have been quietly reassigned since then. Good agents, career agents, all because they asked too many questions about 3 supposedly dead men. Why? If they drowned like the report says, what's the threat? Her laugh was hollow. That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? All I know is that certain people in very high places want Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers to stay dead, and they're willing to destroy careers to keep it that way. She slid an envelope across the table. I couldn't get you the files, but I managed to copy some of the index pages before they were sealed. Names, dates, reference numbers. Maybe you can piece together what we're not supposed to know. The documents were fragmentary, frustratingly incomplete, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. Cross-references to CIA front companies, mentions of asset recovery protocol, transfer authorization signed by officials whose names I recognized from the intelligence community. Most disturbing was a memo dated July 1962, just 1 month after the escape. Subjects may possess operational value. Recommend immediate field assessment rather than standard fugitive protocols. Operational value, not the language you'd use for bank robbers and car thieves. That night, in my Washington hotel room, I called Lieutenant Carson to report my findings. The conversation was brief and cryptic. "Ray, you need to come home. Now. I've got leads here, Lieutenant. Real leads." The leads will be there when you get back, if you get back. There are people asking questions about your questions, and those people have resources we don't. Come home." The line went dead. I packed quickly, checking the hallway twice before leaving my room. During the taxi ride to the airport, I noticed the same black sedan in my mirrors that had followed me from the archives building 3 days earlier. Back in San Francisco, Carson met me at the airport personally, something he'd never done before. His first words were a warning. "Your hotel room was searched yesterday. Professional job. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but they wanted you to know they'd been there." As we drove through the city, he filled me in on developments from my end. Miguel Santos, the fisherman who found the paddle, died in a car accident outside Portland last week. Single vehicle collision on a straight road, clear weather, and Mrs. Hutchins, the lady who saw the car theft, moved to Phoenix, left no forwarding address. Her old neighbours say federal agents visited her the day before she left. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone connected to evidence contradicting the official narrative was disappearing, voluntarily or otherwise. The Alcatraz case wasn't just closed, it was being actively suppressed by people with resources and authority I couldn't match. "What do I do, Lieutenant?" Carson pulled over and turned to face me. In 30 years of police work, I'd never seen him look so serious. "You write a report confirming the drowning theory. You file it properly. You forget everything you've learned, and you pray that's enough to keep you breathing." But I couldn't forget. The faces in those photographs. The fear in Mary Anglin's eyes. The systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Somewhere out there, the truth was buried so deep that powerful people were willing to destroy lives to keep it hidden. The question was whether I was brave enough, or stupid enough, to keep digging. Tony the Fish Marconi wasn't the kind of informant you'd find in a police procedural manual. A small-time smuggler with ties to both San Francisco's waterfront and various federal agencies that preferred not to be named, Tony survived by knowing when to talk and when to disappear. When he agreed to meet me at a dive bar in North Beach, I knew the information would be worth the risk. "You're playing with fire, Detective," he said, stirring his whiskey with a nicotine-stained finger. "The Alcatraz thing? That ain't just a prison break, that's connected to some heavy government business." "What kind of business?" Tony glanced around the dim bar, noting the exits, the other patrons, the bartender's attention. Old habits from a life lived in the shadows. "You ever hear of something called the Prometheus Group?" I shook my head. "Private contractors, black budget operations, the kind of people who make problems disappear for Uncle Sam. Word on the street is they were running recruitment out of the Bay Area in the early 60s, looking for specific types, intelligent, adaptable, morally flexible, men who'd already proven they could operate outside the law." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying Morris and the Anglins were recruited?" "I'm saying Morris had an IQ of 133 and a talent for planning that impressed even the prison psychologists. The Anglin brothers were mechanical geniuses who could improvise solutions from scrap metal and determination. During the Cold War, those were valuable skills." Tony drained his whiskey and signalled for another. "Think about it. 3 men plan the perfect escape from America's most secure prison. They disappear without a trace, despite the biggest manhunt in federal history. Either they're criminal masterminds beyond anything we've seen, or they had help. Professional help. What kind of help? The kind that comes with new identities, transportation, and assignments in places where questions aren't asked. South America was crawling with intelligence operations in the 60s. Cuba, Chile, Brazil. All potential flashpoints that needed experienced operators who couldn't be traced back to Washington. The theory was insane, but it explained the evidence I'd uncovered. The systematic suppression of information, the classified file transfers, the fear I'd encountered at every level of government. If the Alcatraz escape had been a recruitment operation disguised as a prison break, then admitting the men survived would expose a covert program that violated everything America claimed to stand for. "There's another possibility," Tony continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Maybe they weren't recruited. Maybe they stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Such as... Alcatraz was more than a prison detective. It was a research facility. Mind control experiments, interrogation techniques, pharmaceutical trials. the kind of work that required subjects who couldn't complain to their congressman. What if Morris and the Anglins saw something during their time there? What if their escape wasn't about freedom, it was about exposure? My mind reeled with the implications. If the escapees had witnessed classified experiments, their capture wouldn't result in a return to prison. It would result in permanent silence. I've heard whispers, Tony continued. Black sites in Nevada, facilities that don't appear on any government maps, places where inconvenient people go to be forgotten, the kind of places where 3 escaped prisoners might end up if they knew too much. He finished his second whiskey and stood to leave. One more thing, Detective. You know why they call it the Prometheus Group? I shook my head. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. The gods punished him by chaining him to a rock where eagles ate his liver for eternity. Some gifts come with a price that never stops being paid. After Tony left, I sat in that dim bar for another hour, trying to process what he'd told me. 3 theories, each more disturbing than the last. Theory 1. Cold War recruitment. The escape was facilitated by intelligence agencies looking for deniable assets. Morris and the Anglins were extracted, given new identities, and deployed to international hotspots where their criminal skills could serve national interests. Theory 2. Witness protection in reverse. The men had seen classified activities at Alcatraz and escaped to avoid being silenced. Their continued existence threatened to expose government programs that officially didn't exist. Theory 3. The darkest possibility. They were captured alive after the escape and disappeared into the black site system, spending the rest of their lives as test subjects or interrogation practice for intelligence agencies that viewed them as expendable assets. Each theory explained the evidence I'd gathered. Each theory justified the extreme measures taken to suppress the truth. And each theory meant that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers faced something far worse than drowning in San Francisco Bay. They faced erasure from history itself. 6 months later, against direct orders from Lieutenant Carson and my own better judgment, I found myself on a flight to Rio de Janeiro. The lead had come through Tony Marconi's network, a bartender in Ipanema who claimed to remember 2 American men matching the Anglin's description, regulars at his establishment from 1971 to 1978. They paid cash, spoke little Portuguese, and never talked about their past, the bartender Carlos told me through a translator. But they were different from other expatriates, more careful, always watching the exits, never sitting with their backs to the door. The description matched surveillance training, the kind of operational security taught to intelligence assets. Carlos produced a photograph taken during a Christmas party in 1975. A grainy image showing 2 men at the edge of the celebration, their faces partially obscured but their body language unmistakably American. My hands trembled as I studied the picture. The man on the left had the same jawline, the same ears, the same way of holding his shoulders that I'd memorized from Clarence Anglin's prison files. The other figure showed signs of premature aging, stress lines and grey hair that suggested a life lived under constant tension. What happened to them? I asked. Carlos's expression darkened. They left suddenly, in the middle of the night. One day they were here, the next day their apartment was empty. The landlord said men in suits had come asking questions the week before, Americans but not tourists, government men. I spent another week in Rio following leads that grew colder with each passing day. The apartment building where the mystery Americans had lived was scheduled for demolition, its records mysteriously lost in a fire. The bank where they had allegedly maintained accounts had no record of American customers from that period. Every trail ended in convenient dead ends and missing documentation. On my final night in Brazil, I was approached by a man claiming to be a freelance journalist who'd been investigating the same story. We met at a beachside cafe in Copacabana, the sound of waves masking our conversation from potential surveillance. "You're the American detective asking about the Alcatraz escapees," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. I neither confirmed nor denied, waiting for him to continue. "I've been working this story for 3 years," he said, "following reports of American fugitives throughout South America. The trail is real, detective, too real. These men lived here, worked here, built lives here. But every time I get close to proof, the sources disappear, witnesses relocate, documents vanish. I've had my hotel room searched, my phone tapped, my sources intimidated. He slid a manila envelope across the table. This is everything I've gathered. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, hidden in different locations for 3 years, copied and recopied to prevent loss. It's yours now. Why? Because I'm done. Yesterday, I received a visit from 2 men with American accents and no identification. They politely suggested that my investigation was endangering people I cared about. They showed me photographs of my sister's children playing in a park in São Paulo. Very clear photographs. Very recent photographs. The envelope contained a treasure trove of evidence. Bank records showing regular deposits to accounts held by men with obviously false Brazilian identities. Employment records from construction companies that had hired American workers without proper documentation. Hotel registries with signatures that bore striking resemblances to handwriting samples I'd obtained from Alcatraz. Most compelling was a photograph dated 1976 showing 3 men at a construction site in the Amazon basin. 2 matched the Anglin brothers' physical descriptions. The third was older, lean, with the kind of penetrating stare I remembered from Frank Morris's mugshot. All 3 wore work clothes and hard hats, looking like ordinary labourers except for their distinctly American postures and expressions. But like every other lead I'd followed, this one ended in frustration and fear. When I tried to contact the construction company, I learned it had been dissolved in 1979. The site where the photograph was taken was now underwater, flooded by a dam project that had relocated the entire local population. The pattern was always the same. Evidence of survival followed by systematic elimination of that evidence. Either I was chasing ghosts or someone with vast resources was staying 1 step ahead of every investigation. My flight back to San Francisco was delayed by mysterious mechanical problems. During the 6-hour layover in Mexico City, I noticed the same 2 men in different locations throughout the terminal. Always at a distance, always watching, never making direct contact. When I finally boarded the plane, they weren't among the passengers. Lieutenant Carson met me at San Francisco International with news that made my blood run cold. Federal marshals raided your apartment yesterday, Ray. Warrant signed by a judge I've never heard of, for evidence in a case they wouldn't specify. They took everything. Your files, your notes, your photographs, everything connected to Alcatraz. In the car ride home, he handed me an official-looking document. Transfer orders, effective immediately. You're being reassigned to the robbery division. Your Alcatraz investigation is officially terminated. On whose authority? Authority high enough that questioning it would end both our careers. Carson's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Ray, I've been a cop for 28 years. I've seen corruption, cover-ups and conspiracies, but I've never seen anything like this. The pressure to shut you down is coming from levels of government I didn't know existed. He pulled over in a secluded area of Golden Gate Park and turned to face me directly. Whatever you found down there, whatever you think you know, it's not worth your life. These people have made careers disappear for asking the wrong questions. They can make people disappear too. As he spoke, a black sedan with government plates drove slowly past us, its occupants clearly visible through tinted windows that somehow allowed us to see their faces while hiding their expressions. The message was unmistakable. We were being watched, our conversation monitored, our future actions carefully noted. That night, alone in my ransacked apartment, I realised the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just a cover-up of a prison escape. It was the systematic suppression of a truth so dangerous that the most powerful government in the world was willing to destroy lives to protect it. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't just escaped from Alcatraz. They'd escaped into a shadow world where truth became enemy of the state, where survival meant accepting lies, and where the greatest prison of all was the silence that surrounded their fate. But silence, I was beginning to understand, has its own way of speaking to those willing to listen. 25 years passed like pages torn from a calendar and scattered by the wind. I worked robbery division, collected my pension, and tried to convince myself that some truths were better left buried. The Alcatraz case became a ghost that haunted my dreams. 3 faces staring at me from the depths of San Francisco Bay, asking why I'd abandoned the search for their story. Then came January 2013, and a letter that changed everything. The History Channel documentary was running old Alcatraz footage when the phone rang. It was my former partner, Jimmy Chen, now working cold cases for the FBI. His voice carried the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. "Ray, you need to see this. Someone sent a letter to the Bureau claiming to be John Anglin. Says he's dying of cancer, wants to make a deal. Information about the escape in exchange for medical treatment." My hands shook as I read the photocopied letter Jimmy brought to my house that evening. The handwriting was shaky with age and illness, but certain flourishes matched the Christmas cards Marie Anglin had shown me decades earlier. The details were specific, accurate, insider knowledge that only someone who'd lived through the escape could possess. "It's a hoax," Jimmy said, watching my reaction. "Has to be. FBI handwriting analysis says inconclusive. Could be authentic, could be someone who studied the case extensively. But I knew better. The letter wasn't just about the escape. It mentioned details that had never been made public. References to guard rotation patterns that were classified. Descriptions of cell modifications that weren't in any official report. Knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been there, who'd lived through those final months of preparation. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "The letter mentions a meeting place, coordinates in the Bay Area, where supposedly Frank Morris left something hidden before the escape. Information that was too dangerous to carry. The writer claims it's still there, waiting for someone brave enough to look. The coordinates led to a section of Angel Island State Park, near the spot where the makeshift raft materials had been found 51 years earlier. Against every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed, I found myself hiking those trails the following weekend, searching for something I couldn't name. It was hidden in a cave that didn't appear on any park maps, sealed behind rocks that looked natural but showed tool marks when examined closely. A waterproof container, military surplus from the 1960s, containing documents that made my blood run cold. Guard schedules from Alcatraz, annotated with personal notes about corruption and smuggling operations. Photographs of prison officials meeting with men in expensive suits who didn't appear in any government directories. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts to wardens and guards who lived far beyond their official salaries. Most damning was a handwritten journal in Frank Morris's distinctive script, documenting what he'd witnessed during his time at Alcatraz. The prison wasn't just housing criminals, it was housing witnesses to government activities that violated constitutional protections. Political prisoners who'd been disappeared from the mainland. Foreign nationals being held without diplomatic notification. Test subjects for psychological experiments that would later be revealed as part of the MKUltra program. The final entry, dated 2 days before the escape, was prophetic in its certainty. We're not breaking out to be free, we're breaking out to stay alive. What we know, what we've seen, makes us more dangerous to them than any criminal they've ever housed. If we stay, we disappear quietly. If we escape and get caught, we disappear loudly. Our only chance is to vanish completely and hope the truth survives us. The documents explained everything. The official insistence on the drowning theory, the suppression of evidence, the systematic elimination of witnesses. The Alcatraz escape wasn't a crime to be solved. It was a national security incident to be contained. Morris and the Anglins hadn't just witnessed classified activities. They documented them, created a record of government crimes that could destroy careers and topple administrations. Their escape was both an act of desperation and a gamble that someday someone would be brave enough to tell their story. Reading those pages in the dim light of that hidden cave, I finally understood the true scope of the self-destruction paradox. The very actions taken to hide the truth had preserved it. The efforts to silence witnesses had created evidence. The attempts to erase history had documented it in detail. But understanding the truth and proving it were different challenges entirely. The men who'd orchestrated the cover-up were dead or retired, their crimes protected by classification systems and institutional amnesia. The witnesses were gone, scattered or silenced by 5 decades of systematic intimidation. Yet the letter kept haunting me. Someone claiming to be John Anglin, dying and desperate, reaching out across 50 years of silence to offer one final revelation. The FBI had dismissed it as a hoax, but their dismissal felt too quick, too certain, too reminiscent of the patterns I'd seen decades earlier. Late at night, when the pain in my chest reminded me of my own mortality, I wondered about the fates of 3 men who'd gambled everything on an impossible escape. Had they found freedom in the jungles of South America? Had they lived out their days under assumed names, carrying secrets too dangerous to share? Or had they been caught, disappeared into black sites where their knowledge died with them? The letter writer claimed John Anglin had survived into the 21st century, living with the weight of knowledge that could never be shared, watching as history branded him a criminal, while the real criminals wore badges and held office. If true, it was a torture more cruel than any prison cell, to know the truth and be unable to speak it, to carry justice in your heart while injustice wore your name. I kept the documents for 6 months before making my decision. They couldn't stay hidden. Too many people had died to protect these secrets, and too many others deserved to know the truth. But releasing them publicly would accomplish nothing except getting me killed and the evidence destroyed. Instead, I chose a different path. I copied everything, hid the copies in locations scattered across the country, and left instructions for their release upon my death. If the government wanted to suppress the truth, they'd have to do it posthumously, when I could no longer be intimidated or eliminated. The original documents I returned to their hiding place on Angel Island, along with my own written account of the investigation. Future generations might find them, might understand what they represented, might finally give Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers the justice they'd been denied for over half a century. But justice, I was learning, was a luxury the living could rarely afford. It was a gift we could only leave for the dead, a truth we could only speak when our own voices had been silenced. The morphine makes it difficult to focus, but I need to finish this recording while I still can. The doctors say hours now, maybe a day if I'm stubborn enough to fight the inevitable. I've been fighting for 78 years. What's one more battle against the darkness? I've spent 53 years carrying the weight of what I learned about Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. 53 years of waking up in cold sweats, wondering if today would be the day federal agents knocked on my door with a permanent solution to my inconvenient knowledge. 53 years of looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror, and jumping at unexpected phone calls. The truth is a heavy burden when you're carrying it alone. I don't know if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lived out their days in Brazilian freedom, sipping caipirinhas on Ipanema Beach and laughing at the federal agents who'd spent decades searching for their corpses. I don't know if they died namelessly in some government facility, their final words lost in soundproof rooms designed to swallow screams. But I do know this with absolute certainty. They didn't drown in San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The evidence was always there for anyone brave enough to look past the official narrative. The car theft, the witness statements, the photographs from South America, the Christmas cards signed with familiar initials, each piece individually dismissed as coincidence or hoax, but collectively forming a picture of survival that powerful people needed to deny. The government's insistence on the drowning theory wasn't about maintaining Alcatraz's reputation or protecting prison security. It was about hiding activities that violated every principle America claimed to represent. The research programs, the intelligence operations, the systematic elimination of witnesses, all of it justified by national security classifications that turned constitutional protections into classified waste paper. Morris and the Anglins weren't just criminals who pulled off the perfect escape. They were inconvenient witnesses to state-sanctioned crimes, men whose continued existence threatened to expose a shadow government that operated beyond law, beyond oversight, beyond accountability. Their escape became their crime, their knowledge became their death sentence, their survival became a national security threat that required decades of cover-ups, intimidation, and murder to contain. I've left evidence of everything I'd discovered, hidden in multiple locations protected by legal arrangements that will trigger automatic release upon my death. Some truths are too important to die with the men who discover them. The morphine is winning now, and the room is getting darker, But before I fade away, I want to leave you with this final thought. Alcatraz was never escape-proof because its walls were too high or its waters too cold. It was escape-proof because the government made survival more dangerous than imprisonment, freedom more terrifying than captivity. The greatest prison isn't built with stone and steel. It's built with silence and fear, with official denials and convenient accidents, with careers destroyed and witnesses disappeared. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't die in San Francisco Bay. The bay didn't kill them. The silence did. And silence. Silence is the strongest prison of all. But even silence eventually comes to an end. Recording ends with the sound of steady breathing that gradually grows fainter, until only the mechanical hum of hospital equipment remains. Found among Detective Raymond Kowalski's personal effects, along with detailed instructions for the release of sealed documents and recordings. To whoever finds this recording and follows the trail I've left behind, my name was Detective Raymond Kowalski, badge number 2847, San Francisco Police Department. I died on December 20th, 2021, at 3:17 a.m., alone except for the ghosts of 3 men whose story I spent a lifetime trying to tell. If you're reading this, it means the legal mechanisms I put in place have been triggered. Safety deposit boxes in 7 different states will have been opened. Law offices in 4 different cities will have released sealed documents. Digital files stored in multiple secure locations will have been automatically transmitted to journalists, historians, and government oversight committees. I've spent 53 years preparing for this moment, the moment when my voice could finally break the silence that has protected one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. The documents you now have access to represent only a fraction of what was hidden. For every piece of evidence I managed to preserve, dozens more were destroyed by people who understood that truth was their greatest enemy. But what remains is enough. Enough to prove that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived their escape from Alcatraz. Enough to demonstrate the systematic suppression of evidence by multiple government agencies. Enough to show that the official narrative was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect state secrets more valuable than human lives. I need you to understand something. The men who orchestrated this cover-up weren't comic book villains twirling their mustaches in shadowy rooms. They were patriots in their own minds. They believed that protecting classified operations was more important than acknowledging 3 escaped prisoners. They convinced themselves that national security justified any level of deception, any amount of witness intimidation, any degree of evidence suppression. They were wrong. In a democracy, truth cannot be classified indefinitely. Justice cannot be postponed forever. The families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers deserve to know their fates. The American people deserve to know what their government did in their name. History deserved an accurate record, not a convenient fiction. I've carried this burden alone because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, my reputation, my life. Afraid of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or a disgruntled cop. Afraid that speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except getting me killed. But fear, I've learned, is just another form of prison. And like Alcatraz itself, it's only escape-proof, as long as you believe the walls are stronger than your determination to break free. To the families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, your loved ones were not the criminals history has made them out to be. They were witnesses to government crimes who paid the ultimate price for their knowledge. Whether they found freedom in South America or died in government custody, they deserved better than 50 years of official denial and systematic character assassination. To the government officials who will undoubtedly attempt to discredit these revelations, your time is over. The men who created this cover-up are dead. The operations they were protecting have been declassified or exposed through other channels. The only thing your continued denials accomplish is further damage to public trust in institutions that have already lost too much credibility. To the historians and journalists who will investigate these claims, be careful, be thorough, be brave. The people who killed witnesses and destroyed evidence may be gone, but the systems they created to protect state secrets remain in place. Truth-telling is still a dangerous profession in America. To Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, wherever your final resting places may be, your story is finally being told. Your truth is finally being spoken. Your silence is finally being broken. You escaped from Alcatraz on June 11th, 1962. You survived the waters of San Francisco Bay. You lived beyond that night, whatever your ultimate fates may have been. History will remember you not as the criminals who failed to escape, but as the men who succeeded too well for the government's comfort. Your greatest escape wasn't from prison. It was from the official narrative that tried to erase you from history. That escape, at least, was permanent. Final statement for the record. I, Detective Raymond Kowalski, being of sound mind and facing imminent death, do hereby swear under oath that every statement in this recording and its accompanying documents represents the truth as I discovered it through my official investigation into the Alcatraz escape of 1962. I have knowingly risked my career, my safety, and my life to preserve this information. I have done so not for personal gain or professional advancement, but because I believe that in a democracy, truth belongs to the people, not to the bureaucrats who find it inconvenient. If my death occurs under suspicious circumstances, if these documents are somehow suppressed or discredited, if this recording mysteriously disappears, let it stand as evidence that the cover-up I've documented continues to claim lives. But if this message reaches you intact, if the truth I've preserved finally sees daylight, then maybe, just maybe, the strongest prison of all has finally been breached. The silence is broken, the truth is free, and Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers can finally rest in peace, knowing their story has been told. Badge 2847, signing off for the final time. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel more than you possibly know, and we deeply appreciate your support. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now, let's begin. Imagine for a moment that humanity's greatest mistake wasn't reaching too far into space, but looking too deep into our own oceans. Imagine that beneath miles of dark water, something was found that was never meant to be disturbed. Something ancient, something aware, something that had been watching us long before we ever thought to watch the stars. In 1978, a NASA contractor recorded 18 minutes of footage that would never be shown to the public. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Within a year, NASA abandoned all ocean exploration and never gave a real explanation why. This is not a story about what might be out there in space. This is a story about what we found down here, and why someone decided we should never look again. This is the story of why NASA really left the ocean. The Abyss Protocol, why NASA really left the ocean. July 1978. The Pacific Basin stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface calm under a blanket of stars. The research vessel Pacific Surveyor rolled gently in the swell, its deck lights the only human presence for 300 miles in any direction. But 12,000 feet below, in a world of crushing pressure and absolute darkness, something impossible was about to be recorded. Marvin Elridge had been working with NASA contractors for nearly 6 years. His specialty was deep scanning sonar technology, the kind that could map the ocean floor with unprecedented detail. At 42 years old, Marvin was methodical, careful, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured and verified. He had 2 daughters in college, a mortgage in San Diego, and absolutely no patience for speculation or wild theories. He dealt in data, numbers, provable facts. On this particular night, Marvin was aboard the Pacific Surveyor conducting what should have been routine scans as part of the NOAA and NASA Joint Ocean Floor Imaging Program. The mission parameters were straightforward: map a 60 square mile section of seafloor, catalogue any geological features of interest, collect core samples if time permitted. Routine, standard, boring even. He had been on deck drinking coffee, looking at the stars and thinking about whether his oldest daughter would actually finish her engineering degree when the sonar operator called him over around 11:30. The young technician's voice had an edge to it that made Marvin put down his coffee cup and head inside immediately. The screen showed something that shouldn't exist at that depth. Right angles, perfect 90-degree geometry. At 12,000 feet below sea level, nature doesn't create right angles. Erosion, pressure and time smooth everything into curves and irregular shapes. Coral builds organically. Lava flows and hardens in chaotic patterns. Rock fractures along stress lines that are never perfectly perpendicular. But there it was on the display, clear as day. A structure. Marvin ordered the submersible to make another pass. The automated system descended slowly, its lights cutting through the darkness in narrow cones that revealed only small sections of the vast emptiness. This time, they picked up something else. Metal reflections. The sonar was bouncing back signatures consistent with manufactured materials. Not rock, not biological matter. Metal, beneath more than 2 miles of ocean water. The technician adjusted the frequency range, trying to get a clearer reading. "Sir, this doesn't make sense. The return signature is too clean. It's like scanning a building, not a geological formation." Marvin watched the screen, his engineering mind trying to find a rational explanation. A sunken ship, maybe. Except ships don't sink in geometric patterns. They don't end up perfectly aligned on the seafloor, and they don't extend for over half a mile in each direction. Then the readings went wild. Something massive was moving beneath the sediment, not swimming through the water above it, moving beneath it, displacing tons of seafloor material as it shifted position. The displacement calculations appeared on the secondary screen, and Marvin felt his mouth go dry. Whatever was moving down there was at least 800 feet long. The mass estimate kept climbing as the computer tried to calculate volume and density. The submersible's cameras captured only darkness and swirling sediment, but the sonar painted a picture of something vast and deliberately hidden. The object was rising, not quickly, but steadily, pushing up through layers of silt that had probably accumulated over thousands of years. "Pull it back," Marvin said quietly. "Bring the sub up, now." But before the operator could execute the command, every instrument aboard the submersible simultaneously failed. The video feed cut to static. The sonar went dark. The navigation system stopped transmitting. Even the backup systems, designed to function independently, all died at exactly the same instant. The control room fell silent except for the hum of the ship's generators. Marvin stared at the blank screens, his heart pounding. In 6 years of deep ocean work, he had never seen a total system failure like this. Equipment broke down, sensors malfunctioned, but everything at once. That didn't happen by accident. They waited. 3 hours of running emergency protocols trying to re-establish contact with the submersible, calculating drift patterns, and preparing the backup recovery system. When they finally retrieved the sub just after 3 a.m, Marvin was the first one to examine it. The exterior showed signs of exposure to an electromagnetic pulse, scorch marks on the sensor housings. The camera lenses had a strange crystalline pattern etched into them, like they had been exposed to intense magnetic fields. The recording equipment was completely fried, every circuit board melted into useless slag. But Marvin had already seen enough. He had watched the readings in real time. He knew what was down there, even if he couldn't prove it anymore. The official report, filed 2 weeks later, contained exactly 4 words about the incident. Seafloor anomaly, equipment malfunction. Nothing about the geometry. Nothing about the metal signatures. Nothing about the massive moving object. Just equipment malfunction. Marvin read the report 3 times, each time feeling more certain that someone was actively burying what they had found. He had submitted a detailed account. 12 pages of technical observations, sonar readings, equipment analysis, and recommendations for follow-up investigation. All of it reduced to 4 words in the final document. Marvin Elridge wasn't the type to let things go. He started making calls, reaching out to colleagues at other oceanographic institutions, contacting journalists who had covered scientific discoveries before. He was careful about it, or at least he thought he was. He never mentioned aliens or conspiracy theories. He just talked about anomalous readings that deserved further study. He used technical language. He cited data. But someone was listening to those calls. Someone was reading those emails. And someone decided that Marvin Elridge was becoming a problem. 3 weeks after he started making noise, Marvin died in a single car accident on Interstate 5, just north of San Diego. It was a clear Tuesday morning. No rain, no fog, excellent visibility. Traffic was light. According to witnesses, his car had been travelling normally in the right lane when it suddenly accelerated, veered across 3 lanes of traffic, and crashed into the centre divider at over 90 miles per hour. The police report called it mechanical failure. The accident investigation found that his brake lines had corroded through completely. Strange, the investigator noted in his report, because the vehicle had passed a safety inspection just 1 month earlier with no issues noted. Strange too that all 4 brake lines had corroded in exactly the same way, at exactly the same rate, as if someone had deliberately weakened them with chemicals designed to fail after a specific period of time. But those observations stayed in the investigator's notes and never made it into the official conclusion. Mechanical failure, accidental death, case closed. Marvin's wife received his life insurance payout without any problems. His daughters finished college. His name appeared in a few professional journals as a contributor to oceanic research. And then he was forgotten, just another scientist who had devoted his career to expanding human knowledge and died too young in an unfortunate accident. Within a year, NASA quietly ended all deep ocean involvement. No press conference, no explanation. The agency that had spent nearly 2 decades exploring Earth's oceans simply walked away. The public never learned why. But the message to anyone else who might have been thinking about speaking up was crystal clear. Some discoveries are not meant to be shared. But the truth was buried in classified documents, suppressed testimonies, and deleted records. And it begins with a history that most people have completely forgotten. When NASA was founded on July 29, 1958, the agency's charter contained language that would surprise most Americans today. The Space Act, the founding legislation, specifically stated that NASA's purpose included expansion of human knowledge of phenomena in the atmosphere and space, and critically, a preservation of the role of the United States as a leader in aeronautical and space science and technology, and in the application thereof to the conduct of peaceful activities within and outside the atmosphere. But there was another clause, often overlooked in modern discussions, that explicitly mentioned oceanic research as part of the agency's environmental studies mandate. This wasn't a secondary mission added later. Ocean exploration was written directly into NASA's founding purpose, right alongside space exploration. The reasoning was sound. If NASA wanted to understand how life might exist on other planets, They needed to study the most extreme environments on Earth, and nothing on Earth compares to the deep ocean. Crushing pressure, no light, extreme cold or extreme heat near thermal vents, toxic chemistry. If life could exist in those conditions, it could theoretically exist anywhere in the solar system. Throughout the early 1960s and into the 1970s, NASA and NOAA worked hand in hand. They weren't just partners on paper. They were running joint missions into some of the deepest and most unexplored regions on the planet. The Tektite Habitat program put scientists underwater for extended periods, studying the psychological and physiological effects of isolation in extreme environments. The data was meant to prepare for future space stations. NASA developed submersible technology that would later influence the design of spacecraft. They created underwater communication systems that could function under crushing pressure and through miles of water. These same principles would be applied to interplanetary communication. They mapped deep ocean vents that had never been seen by human eyes, discovering ecosystems that survived without sunlight, feeding on chemicals from Earth's interior. The technology NASA created for ocean exploration was genuinely revolutionary. They built robotics meant specifically for underwater environments, not space. These machines could withstand pressures exceeding 16,000 pounds per square inch. They could navigate in complete darkness using advanced sonar arrays that could map terrain in 3 dimensions, and they could go deeper than anyone had gone before. Project Famous, the French-American mid-ocean undersea study, put scientists in submersibles at depths of nearly 9,000 feet to directly observe seafloor spreading along the mid-Atlantic ridge. NASA scientists worked alongside French oceanographers, developing techniques that would later be used for remote planetary exploration. The missions were wildly successful. NASA's ocean programs were discovering new species almost weekly. They were mapping geological formations that changed our understanding of plate tectonics. They were proving that life could exist in conditions we'd previously thought impossible. The funding was solid. The science was groundbreaking. International partnerships were strong. There was every reason to continue and expand these programs. Then, seemingly overnight, everything stopped. By 1980, NASA's ocean projects had completely evaporated. Funding was eliminated across the board. Directives were sealed under classification protocols. Personnel were reassigned or let go. NASA's focus shifted entirely and exclusively to space. The official explanation given to the few people who asked was simple. Budget priorities changed. But that explanation never made sense. NASA's ocean missions were thriving. They were producing results. They were operating within budget. And yet someone, somewhere, made the decision to shut it all down immediately. Not gradually. Not through budget cuts over time. Immediately. The timing was unusual for another reason. This was the same period when deep ocean exploration technology had finally advanced to the point where humanity could access the deepest trenches on Earth. The Mariana Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, places where the ocean floor drops more than 6 miles below the surface, places where the pressure is over 1,000 times greater than at sea level, places where, until the 1970s, humanity simply couldn't go. But now we could. And then, suddenly, we didn't. Someone forced NASA to abandon the ocean. Someone with enough authority to override the agency's founding mandate. Someone who had seen something in those classified reports that changed everything. Fast forward to 2022. A marine archivist named Lena Hart Boone was working at a federal records facility in Maryland. At 38 years old, Lena had spent her entire adult life around documents. She had a graduate degree in library science and a fascination with maritime history that had started in childhood, growing up in a fishing community on the Carolina coast. Her father had been a commercial fisherman who loved to tell stories about strange things seen far out at sea. Lights beneath the water, sounds that didn't match any known, marine animal, the ocean's mysteries. Most of Lena's colleagues found her job tedious. Endless boxes of faded papers, decades-old reports that nobody would ever read. budget documents and personnel files and meeting minutes from agencies that no longer existed. But Lena loved it. She loved the detective work of piecing together forgotten histories. She loved finding the human stories buried in bureaucratic language. Her job was relatively mundane, cataloguing and digitising old government documents related to maritime research. Boxes and boxes of forgotten papers, most of it routine bureaucratic material. She worked methodical hours in a climate-controlled room with fluorescent lights and no windows. She brought the same lunch every day, a turkey sandwich and an apple, which she ate while reading whatever document she was currently processing. Her co-workers thought she was quiet, maybe a little obsessive about details, but good at her work. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in March, she opened a box that had been misfiled for decades. It contained materials that should have been in NASA's archives, not buried in a maritime storage facility. The box had been labelled NOAA Personnel Records, 1970 to 1980, and was supposed to contain routine employment documents. But the contents didn't match the label. Inside were technical reports, mission logs, and equipment manifests all bearing NASA identification codes. And buried at the bottom, underneath routine paperwork about supply orders and maintenance schedules, was a handwritten logbook that would change Lena's life forever. The log was labelled Deep Dive 7, Tonga Trench, November 1976, Elridge Team. Lena recognised the name immediately. Marvin Elridge. Over the years, she had come across his name in footnotes and passing references while cataloguing other ocean exploration documents. He had died in a car accident in 1978. Some of the documents she'd seen suggested he had been trying to report unusual findings before his death, but the details were always vague, and most sources dismissed him as someone who had become obsessed with unlikely theories. She set her half-eaten sandwich aside and opened the logbook with the careful reverence she reserved for potentially significant documents. The entries were technical at first, depth readings in precise measurements, sonar configurations with frequency ranges and pulse intervals, equipment checks listing every system by designation number, standard operational material written in the shorthand of someone who had filled out these forms hundreds of times. Depth, 11,100 feet. Water temperature, 34 degrees. Sonar functioning at optimal parameters. Beginning survey grid Alpha 7. But as the dive progressed deeper, the tone changed. Marvin's handwriting became less neat, more hurried. The observations more urgent. The technical language gave way to something more immediate, more human. Metallic echo returns at depth 11,200 feet. Configuration suggests manufactured origin. No known geological explanation. Cross-referencing known shipwrecks in region. Negative for all matches. Requesting second pass for confirmation. Second pass complete. Returns identical. Adding thermal imaging. Thermal signature inconsistent with surrounding seafloor. Object retaining heat at depth, where ambient temperature should be stable. No volcanic activity in this region according to all geological surveys. Unidentifiable vibrations detected. Frequency suggests machinery, not seismic activity. Rhythm is too regular. Pattern repeats every 47 seconds. Equipment functioning normally. All diagnostics green. Readings are accurate. Then came an entry that Lena read 3 times. Her sandwich forgotten, her coffee growing cold beside her. Movement detected beneath sediment layer. Displacement calculations suggest object of immense size. Initial estimate, 800 feet length, possibly larger. Depth of burial suggests object has been here for considerable time, yet movement indicates active state. Too massive and too fast to be biological. Repeat, movement characteristics are too massive and too coordinated to be biological in nature. The next entry was written in a different pen, suggesting Marvin had taken a break and then returned to write what happened next. Emergency protocols initiated. Object began rising towards submersible, not swimming, rising straight up through sediment layers as if pushing through. Debris cloud massive, pressure wave detected by hull sensors, auto ascent engaged at 11:43, sub under extreme stress, hull integrity at 78%. Lost all sensor contact with object at depth 10,000 feet during emergency ascent. All systems experienced simultaneous failure. electromagnetic pulse consistent with deliberate countermeasure, not natural phenomenon. Recording equipment destroyed. Visual contact impossible due to sediment cloud. Submersible recovered with extensive electromagnetic damage to all electronic components. Then came the final entry, written in block letters, pressed so hard into the page that the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "We're not alone down here, and they are listening." Lena sat in the archive room for a long time after reading that. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. In the distance, she could hear the muffled sounds of her co-workers moving through the stacks, the quiet routine of the facility continuing around her. But she felt as if something fundamental had shifted. She should have filed the logbook according to protocol and moved on. That was the procedure. Catalogue the material, note any irregularities in a report for her supervisor, and process the next box. But something about this felt too real, too urgent, too deliberately hidden. The handwriting was steady except where urgency had made it rushed. The technical language was precise. This wasn't the work of someone prone to fantasy or exaggeration. This was an engineer documenting observations that terrified him, specifically because they were so clearly measured and verified. Lena looked around the empty archive room. She had worked here for 6 years and had never violated protocol. But she also knew that some documents had a way of disappearing once they entered the classification review process. Important things got buried under bureaucratic procedures all the time. She made copies before returning the original to the box. She told herself she was just being thorough, preserving a potentially significant historical document. Nothing wrong with that. But her hands were shaking slightly as the copier hummed, and she kept glancing toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in and ask what she was doing. Over the next few weeks, Lena began digging deeper. She found a memorandum dated March 1979, stamped with the highest classification markings she had ever seen in maritime archives. The memo was partially redacted, but certain elements were still visible. It was signed by Robert Ballard, the famous deep-sea explorer who would later discover the wreck of the Titanic. It was also signed by Robert Frosch, who was NASA administrator at the time. And there was a third signature line, but the name had been completely blacked out. Not just redacted with a thin line, but covered with heavy black marker, as if someone had been particularly determined to ensure that name never became public. The visible portion of the memo stated, "All oceanic anomaly investigations are to be transferred to a separate classification unit effective immediately. Standard scientific protocols are suspended for designated coordinates pending Department of Defense review." Lena searched every database she had access to. She found no record of NASA ever establishing such a classification unit, at least not publicly. Whatever they had found in the deep ocean, it had been transferred to something beyond normal oversight, something that answered to the military, not civilian science agencies. She needed more information. She needed proof that this wasn't just the paranoid ramblings of one contractor who had seen something he couldn't explain. She needed evidence that the pattern was bigger. She found it in the Navy archives. Through careful requests and legitimate research credentials, Lena gained access to partially declassified Navy sonar logs from the 1970s. These were routine submarine patrol reports that had been sitting in storage for decades. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Position reports, depth readings, contact tracking of other vessels. But scattered throughout the logs were entries that stood out, references to unidentified submerged objects that appeared on sonar and then vanished, reports of sudden accelerations that were physically impossible for any known submarine technology, acoustic shadows that resembled large structural masses but appeared in locations where no structures should exist, and the locations matched: the Tonga Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the Mariana Trench, the 3 deepest places on Earth, the same places where NASA had been conducting their most advanced deep ocean exploration right before they were ordered to stop. The Navy reports used careful language. They never said alien or unknown intelligence. They said things like anomalous contact and unidentified acoustic phenomenon. But the pattern was clear. Something was down there. Multiple Navy vessels had detected it over the course of years. And someone had decided that civilian scientists needed to stop looking. Lena knew she needed to talk to someone who had been there, someone who had worked on NASA's ocean programs and might be willing to talk about what really happened. She found Harlan Vick living in a retirement community in Florida, in a modest apartment that overlooked a small artificial lake. He had worked as a propulsion engineer for NASA from 1964 until his retirement in 1991. His work had focused on developing systems that could function in extreme environments, both space and ocean. His personnel file, which Lena had accessed through legitimate research channels, showed commendations for innovative solutions to pressure vessel design and deep water propulsion systems. When Lena called him and explained what she had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear him breathing, could almost feel him deciding whether to hang up or engage. Then Harlan said something that made her book a flight to Florida the next day. "I was wondering when someone would finally start asking the right questions. I'm 83 years old. I don't have much time left to worry about classification agreements I signed 40 years ago." They met at a small cafe near his retirement community 3 days later. It was a quiet place, mostly empty in the mid-afternoon between lunch and dinner rushes. Harlan was waiting for her at a corner booth, a lean man with age spots on his hands and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a faded NASA polo shirt that had probably been sitting in his closet since the 90s. He ordered coffee and spent a moment organising his thoughts before speaking, his engineer's mind clearly arranging the information in logical sequence. NASA's interest in the oceans was never really about marine biology or geology, he began, his voice quiet but steady. Those were byproducts. Benefits of the research, certainly, but not the primary goal. What we were really doing was searching for analogue environments, places on Earth that resembled conditions we might find on other planets or moons. The deep ocean has no light, crushing pressure that can exceed 16,000 pounds per square inch, extreme cold except near thermal vents where temperatures can exceed 700 degrees, toxic chemistry, acidic conditions. It's as close to an alien world as you can get without leaving Earth. Lena nodded. This was consistent with what she had read in the public-facing mission statements from that era. Europa, Jupiter's moon, has an ocean beneath miles of ice. Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons, has geysers erupting from an underground ocean. If we wanted to understand how to explore those worlds, how to design equipment that could survive those conditions, how to search for life in those environments, we needed to start here, in our own ocean. Harlan took a sip of coffee, his hands steady despite his age. But the deeper we went, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, the more we encountered things that didn't fit any model we had. Sonar reading that showed geometric precision, where only irregular geology should exist. Electromagnetic disturbances with no natural source. Acoustic signatures that suggested machinery operating at depths, where pressure should make any mechanical system impossible, using any technology we understood. "What kind of structures?" Lena asked, leaning forward. Harlan glanced around the cafe, even though no one was sitting close enough to overhear. The gesture seemed automatic, a reflex from decades of security consciousness. The first one was found in 1974, February if I remember correctly, a sonar mapping mission in the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean. They were using a new high-resolution side-scan sonar array, something we had just developed. The resolution was unprecedented for that time. They picked up what looked like a perfectly circular formation at the bottom, 20 miles in diameter. Perfectly circular. They did multiple passes over 3 days. Same result every time. The resolution wasn't good enough to see fine details, but the shape was unmistakable. Nature doesn't make circles that precise, especially not that large. "Why wasn't this announced?" Lena asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because of what happened next," Harlan said, his eyes distant, remembering. "When they sent a submersible down to investigate 2 weeks later, the formation was gone. Not buried under a recent sediment flow, not obscured by a debris field from some underwater landslide. Gone. The seafloor in that location was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. But we had sonar images from just 14 days earlier showing it clear as day. Multiple passes, multiple confirmation scans, then nothing. Lena felt a chill despite the warm Florida afternoon streaming through the cafe windows. The only explanation that made sense was that it had moved, but the implications of that, of something that large moving deliberately and then concealing itself, were too disturbing to put in a report. So the official conclusion was equipment malfunction, a glitch in the new sonar system. Never mind that the same system worked perfectly before and after that mission. The second incident was in 1976 in the Tonga Trench. That's the one Marvin Eldridge was part of. You've seen his logbook, so you know what they found. Metal signatures and right-angle construction at a depth of over 35,000 feet. When they tried to investigate, all their equipment failed simultaneously. Not broke down over time. Not showed signs of degrading performance. Failed. All at once. As if something had actively shut it down with a directed electromagnetic pulse. Harlan paused, and Lena could see him deciding how much to share. And the third, she prompted gently, Mariana Trench, November 1977, a joint mission with the Navy. They weren't looking for anything unusual. They were testing new depth pressure sensors, equipment that could survive in the deepest place on Earth. Boring technical work. But what they found was a massive object sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of 35,800 feet. The sonar images showed what looked like a vessel or structure, except it was too large to be anything humanity has ever built. Length estimated at over half a mile, width approximately 200 feet. Sitting at the deepest point on Earth, in a place where no human had ever been, where pressure should crush anything not specifically designed to withstand it. Harlan's coffee sat forgotten, cooling in front of him. After that mission, everything changed. People from the Department of Defense started showing up at our facilities. Not consultants or liaisons. People with serious security clearances who didn't introduce themselves or explain why they were there. Scientists were pulled aside for private meetings. Documents were reclassified retroactively. And then, very quickly, all ocean programs were shut down. Money was reallocated to space programs. Personnel were reassigned or encouraged to retire. And we were told, very clearly through official and unofficial channels, that we were to focus exclusively on space from that point forward. Did they ever tell you why? Lena asked. Harlan looked at her directly, his engineer's mind clearly deciding to trust her with something he had kept quiet for decades. Not officially. But the rumour among those of us who had been there long enough, who knew how to read between the lines of classified briefings, was simple. Something in the ocean had responded to us. Our sonar pings, our submersibles, our equipment. We had been noticed, observed, scanned, evaluated, and someone at the highest levels of government decided that the appropriate response was to leave it alone, to stop probing, to stop investigating. NASA was told to redirect all resources to space and never come back to the deep ocean. Lena spent hours with Harlan that day, filling notebook after notebook with details. He gave her names of other scientists who had been involved, though he warned that most were dead now. He provided specific dates and mission numbers that she could cross-reference. He described technology that had never been publicly acknowledged. Pressure, vessels capable of withstanding depths that the official record claimed were impossible at the time. Before she left, Harlan reached into his wallet and pulled out a small photograph, faded and creased from years of being carried. It showed a group of people on the deck of a research vessel. Young engineers in their 30s and 40s, squinting in bright sunlight, smiling the way people do in workplace photos. That's the team from the Mariana Trench mission, he said. November 1977. 12 people in that photo. By 1985, 9 of them were dead. Heart attacks, car accidents, 1 drowning, 1 house fire. The official causes were always natural or accidental, but the statistical probability of that many deaths in such a small group over such a short time period is astronomically low. He pointed to a man in the centre of the photo. That's me. And that, he pointed to a woman on the right side, is Marvin Eldridge's sister. She was a systems engineer. Brilliant woman. She died in '84 from what they called a sudden brain aneurysm. She was 39 years old, perfectly healthy, no family history of that condition. Lena looked at the photograph for a long time, at the smiling faces of people who had no idea what they were about to discover or what it would cost them. "Why are you still alive?" she asked quietly. Harlan smiled, but there was no humour in it. "Because I kept my mouth shut. I signed the papers. I accepted the reassignment. I never spoke to journalists or wrote about what we found. I made myself harmless, and apparently they decided I was worth more alive as an example of compliance than dead as a martyr." He paused. "But I'm 83 now. My wife died 2 years ago. My children rarely visit. At this point, I'd rather die having told someone the truth than live another year carrying it alone." 2 weeks later, Harlan Vick was found dead in his apartment by the facility's morning wellness check. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, which wasn't particularly unusual for a man in his 80s with a documented history of cardiac issues. The facility's medical staff noted that he had seemed in good spirits the day before, had eaten a full dinner, and had been seen walking around the artificial lake that evening. But when Lena tried to contact the other names Harlan had given her, she found that 2 had also died in the past 5 years, both from natural causes according to official records. The other 3 names turned up no results at all, as if those people had never existed or had their identities completely scrubbed from all databases. Lena attended Harlan's funeral. It was small, poorly attended. His children were there but seemed uncomfortable, eager to complete the formalities and leave. She was the only person there who wasn't family. After the service, she stood by his grave for a while, looking at the temporary marker that would eventually be replaced with a permanent stone. She noticed a man in a dark suit standing near a tree about 50 yards away. He wasn't trying to hide, but he wasn't participating in the funeral either, just watching. When Lena made eye contact with him, he nodded slightly, then walked to a black sedan and drove away. The message was clear. They knew she had talked to Harlan, they knew what he had told her, and they wanted her to know that they knew. Lena knew she was onto something real now, something that people in power had worked very hard to keep quiet for over 4 decades. She became obsessed with finding more evidence, more proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She spent months cross-referencing coordinates. The logbook from Marvin Elridge's mission had included precise latitude and longitude readings for each sonar anomaly they detected. Lena began plotting these on maps, using modern satellite data and bathymetric charts to see if any patterns emerged. What she found was extraordinary. The anomalies weren't random. They formed a geometric lattice pattern stretching across huge sections of the Pacific Ocean floor. Massive triangular points separated by hundreds of miles, but aligned with mathematical precision. Each point corresponded to one of the deepest trenches or abyssal plains in the Pacific, and they were still there. Modern sonar data, when examined carefully, showed the same unexplained signatures. Not as obvious now, perhaps better hidden or less active, but present. Whatever NASA had found in the 1970s was still there. Lena's search led her to a forgotten archive in the Library of Congress. Among microfilm reels labelled as routine congressional briefings, she found something that didn't belong. A transcript dated November 1977, marked Eyes Only Limited Distribution. The transcript documented a conversation between a NASA oceanographer named Saul Riggin and an unnamed Department of Defense liaison. Lena had to read through the stilted bureaucratic language carefully, but the meaning was clear. Riggin reported that during a deep ocean scan, their equipment had been actively pinged by an unknown source, not passively detected, actively engaged with. The source had used frequencies that matched their own sonar, as if learning and mimicking their technology in real time. The Department of Defense liaison's response was blunt. "You are to shut down all exploration immediately. This is not a NASA matter anymore." Riggin protested. "But it's intelligent. Whatever is down there responded to us deliberately. This is the most important discovery in human history." The liaison's reply was chilling. That's exactly why you're done. This matter is being transferred to agencies with appropriate security protocols. NASA will redirect all resources to space exploration. This decision is not negotiable." The transcript ended there. Lena searched for any follow-up documents, any indication of what appropriate agencies meant, any hint of what happened to Saul Riggin. She found nothing. His name appeared in NASA employment records until 1979, then vanished completely. No retirement notice, no obituary, just gone. But Lena found one more document. It was filed incorrectly, labelled as a budget allocation memo, but the content was far more significant. ABVS Protocol, Level 6 security clearance required, initiated March 1979. The objective was stated in precise bureaucratic language. Transfer all deep ocean findings and related research to Classified Naval Special Projects Division. Prevent public scientific agencies from further contact with designated zones. Redirect NASA resources exclusively to space exploration programs. And then the reason, in a single paragraph that had been partially redacted but was still readable. Containment of non-human submerged intelligence structures to prevent unauthorized contact and potential security breach. Lena read that paragraph 10 times. Non-human submerged intelligence structures, not alien spacecraft, not ancient ruins. Intelligence structures currently active and requiring containment. Something alive, or at least functional, beneath the ocean. NASA didn't choose to abandon the ocean. They were ordered to. They were forced into space to avoid something that had been discovered in the deep. Something that someone in power had decided humanity wasn't ready to know about. Lena understood now why Marvin Eldridge had died. Why Harlan Vick had waited so long to speak. Why every scientist involved had either gone silent or disappeared. This wasn't just classified information. This was something that powerful people wanted to remain buried deeper than the trenches themselves. She should have stopped there. She should have published what she had found and let others take the risk of digging deeper. But Lena couldn't let it go. She needed to see more. She needed proof that couldn't be denied. That's when she started noticing the surveillance. It began subtly. A car parked across the street from her apartment for hours at a time. Engine off, windows tinted. The same vehicle appeared outside the archive where she worked. When she drove to meetings or interviews, the car was always 3 or 4 vehicles behind her in traffic. Her personal computer began acting strangely. Files would be in different folders than where she had left them. Her internet search history would be wiped clean each morning, even though she hadn't cleared it. Her backup drives disappeared from her apartment while she was at work, despite the door being locked and showing no signs of forced entry. Someone was watching her. Someone knew what she was researching, and they wanted her to know that they knew. A former NOAA technician reached out to her through an encrypted email service 2 months after Harlan's death. The message was brief. "I have something you need to see, something they didn't collect. Come alone. Tell no one." It included a date, time, and location. A parking garage in Baltimore at midnight. Every instinct told Lena this was dangerous. Meeting a stranger at midnight with something classified was exactly the kind of thing that ended badly in stories like this. But she'd gone too far to stop now. She drove to Baltimore, parked on a different level than specified, and walked down the concrete stairs to the designated meeting spot. The technician was waiting near a support pillar, a man in his 70s wearing a windbreaker and a baseball cap. He looked nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the garage. He didn't give his name, didn't shake her hand, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I worked with Marvin Eldridge in 1976 and 77, he said quietly. "I was the one who processed the film reels from the submersibles. Every mission, I'd develop the footage, catalogue it and send it up the chain. After the Tonga Trench incident, men in suits showed up and collected everything. Every reel, every photograph, every piece of paper. They went through our facility like it had been raided." He handed her a metal film canister, old and dented, with faded labels barely visible in the dim garage lighting. "This is from the Eldridge mission. Dive 7. I made a copy before they collected the originals. I've kept it hidden for 46 years. I buried it in my backyard inside a waterproof container. I told myself I was keeping it for history, for proof, but really I think I was just too afraid to destroy it, and too afraid to show it to anyone. My wife died last year. My kids don't talk to me. I have cancer. The doctors say I have 6 months, maybe less. I don't know what to do with this anymore, but I know it shouldn't die with me. Maybe you'll know what to do with it. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at her. They killed him, you know. Marvin. It wasn't an accident. He called me 3 days before he died. Said people were following him. Said his house had been searched while he was at work. Nothing taken, but everything subtly moved. Drawers not quite closed the way he left them. Papers in slightly different positions. He knew what was coming. He told me to destroy anything he had ever given me, to forget everything we had talked about. I wish I had listened. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty garage, and was gone. Lena stood there for several minutes, holding the film canister, feeling its weight, understanding that she was now holding something that people had killed to keep hidden. She took the film to a professional restoration service in Virginia, driving 2 hours out of her way, paying cash and claiming it was family footage from a deep-sea fishing trip in the 70s. The technicians were more interested in the technical challenge than the content. Film this old, stored in less than ideal conditions, required careful handling. They cleaned it, stabilised it, and digitised it over 3 days. When Lena finally watched the restored footage on her laptop in a motel room, sitting in the dark with headphones on, she understood why this had been classified, why people had died, why an entire federal agency had been redirected away from the ocean. The video showed the view from a submersible's external camera, the timestamp in the corner marking it as November 17th, 1976 at 22:43 hours. Depth reading, 11,280 feet. At first, there was only darkness and the occasional particle drifting past the lens, caught in the submersible's powerful lights. The view swayed gently as the craft moved through the water. Then the lights illuminated something that made Lena pause the video, rewind, and watch again to confirm she wasn't seeing things. A massive curved surface, clearly metallic, extending beyond the reach of the lights in all directions. The texture was smooth, but not perfectly so. There were patterns etched or moulded into the surface, geometric designs too regular to be corrosion or damage. They looked deliberate, designed. The material itself had a strange quality to it, reflecting the lights in a way that seemed almost to absorb them, creating a darkness that was deeper than the surrounding water. The submersible moved along the surface, and the camera captured more details. What appeared to be seams where different sections met, too precise to be natural geological features. Structures that might have been protrusions, sensors, or ports of some kind. Curved indentations that could have been anything from decorative elements to functional openings. And then something that looked unmistakably like a window. A circular opening, about 15 feet in diameter, filled with what might have been transparent material, though it was impossible to tell in the murky water and dim light. The surface around it had additional geometric patterns, as if marking it as significant. The submersible's lights focused on the window, and Lena watched this section frame by frame, advancing through the video one image at a time. For 3 frames, barely a tenth of a second of real time, something appeared in the reflection of the glass or whatever material filled that circular opening. A shape. Definitely a shape. Not a trick of light or a distortion from the water. Something inside the structure, moving past the window. The resolution wasn't good enough to make out details. It could have been machinery. It could have been something else. But it was there, visible, real, captured on film. Then the lights failed. The video feed dissolved into static, but the recording continued, the timestamp still, advancing. The audio kept running, and Lena had to increase the volume to hear what came next. A low-frequency tone, deep and resonant, felt more than heard even through laptop speakers. Not the sound of machinery or water pressure or any mechanical system she recognised. The frequency was around 20 hertz, right at the edge of human hearing. kind of deep bass that you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. But what made Lena's skin crawl was the pattern. The tone rose and fell in a sequence that repeated. Not random, not mechanical. It had rhythm, it had structure. It sounded almost like language, like something trying to communicate using sound in a frequency range that would travel through water effectively. She played it back multiple times, recording the audio on her phone, analysing the waveform. The pattern repeated every 11 seconds. Each repetition was identical in structure, but varied slightly in amplitude, as if the source was adjusting, testing, learning how to modulate the signal. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The audio went silent except for the quiet hiss of the recording equipment. The video timestamp showed the camera had recorded for another 18 minutes after the lights failed, but that entire section was corrupted or erased, showing only digital artifacts and noise. The footage ended. Lena sat in the dark motel room, her hands shaking slightly. She had just watched proof, real, documented, recorded proof that something intelligent existed in the deep ocean, something that built structures, something that noticed when we came looking, something that responded. Lena tried to contact the technician who had given her the film. His phone number was disconnected. The email address bounced back as non-existent. She drove to the address he had mentioned working from decades ago, but found only an abandoned building. He had vanished, just like everyone else who got too close to the truth. Lena knew she was running out of time. The surveillance was getting more obvious, almost as if whoever was watching wanted her to know they were closing in. She made copies of everything she'd found and distributed them to trusted colleagues, with instructions to release the information if anything happened to her. Then she did something risky. She used the coordinates from the classified documents to search for current military activity in those ocean regions. What she found was surprising. There were naval installations positioned near each of the major anomaly sites, not scientific research stations, military bases, some of them appearing on maps, others only visible through careful cross-referencing of shipping routes and no-fly zones. One installation in particular caught her attention, a naval facility near Pearl Harbor with unusual security protocols. Shipping manifests showed regular transport of materials to and from the facility, but the cargo descriptions were always vague. Research materials, equipment, components, classified payload. Lena travelled to Hawaii on a Tuesday morning in late August. She rented a car under her own name, stayed in a chain hotel and tried to appear like any other tourist. But she spent her days carefully observing the naval facility from various vantage points, using hiking trails and public beaches that offered distant views of the installation. The security was extraordinary. Multiple perimeter fences, each one taller than the last. Guard towers with visible security personnel, sensor arrays that covered every approach, motion detectors, cameras, lights powerful enough to turn night into day. She watched security patrols follow precise patterns, vehicles checking the perimeter every 40 minutes like clockwork. But what interested her most was the shipping activity. Large trucks arrived multiple times per day, always with military police escorts. The containers they carried were standard military issue, but several had markings she could make out through her long lens camera. Abyss, non-terrestrial materials, level 6 clearance required, non-terrestrial materials. The same classification code from the 1979 protocol document. The same code that appeared in the classified memos she'd copied. They were still actively engaged with whatever had been found in the deep ocean. This wasn't ancient history being studied in some forgotten warehouse. This was ongoing, current, active. Lena spent 3 days photographing the facility, documenting the security procedures, noting the arrival and departure patterns. She was careful never to stay in one location too long, never to appear too interested, never to do anything that might flag her as surveillance. But on the third evening, as she sat in her rental car at a scenic overlook several miles from the facility, she noticed a black SUV parked 3 spaces down from her. It had been there when she arrived 30 minutes earlier, and it hadn't moved. The windows were tinted, but she could see the faint silhouette of someone inside. She started her car and drove back toward her hotel. The SUV followed, maintaining a consistent distance of 3 or 4 vehicles behind her, not trying to hide, making sure she knew they were there. Lena's heart rate increased, but she forced herself to drive normally. She pulled into a shopping centre, parked, and went into a grocery store. The SUV parked at the far end of the lot. When she came out 15 minutes later with a bag containing items she didn't need, the SUV was still there. The message was clear. We see you. We know what you're looking for, and we want you to know that we know. That night, Lena sat in her hotel room with all the documents, photos and recordings she had collected spread across the bed. She had enough. Documents proving NASA's sudden withdrawal from ocean exploration. Testimony from scientists who had been there. Film footage showing an underwater structure that couldn't be natural. Photographs of current military operations at coordinates matching the original anomaly sites. She began organising everything into a comprehensive report. She wrote through the night, knowing that once she released this information, there would be no going back. Her life would change irrevocably. She might face legal consequences. She might face worse. But the truth deserved to be known. Whatever was in the ocean, humanity had a right to know about it. Scientists had died trying to bring this information to light. Their deaths shouldn't be meaningless. At 3 a.m, she called a colleague she trusted, another archivist named Thomas Brennan who had worked with her for years, a man who understood the importance of preserving historical truth. The call went to voicemail. Lena's voice was steady but urgent. "Thomas, it's Lena. I need you to listen carefully. NASA left the ocean in 1979 because they found something. Not ancient ruins, not crashed spacecraft. Something alive, something intelligent, living in structures beneath miles of water in the deepest trenches on Earth. They've been there longer than human civilization, probably longer than humans have existed at all. In 1976 and 77, multiple deep ocean missions encountered these structures. Every time we came close, every time we tried to investigate, the equipment failed, but not randomly, deliberately. These things, whatever they are, they responded to us. They noticed us. They actively prevented us from getting too close. And someone at the highest levels of government made a deal, or a decision, or maybe just realised that humanity wasn't ready to know we're not the first intelligent species on this planet. They ordered NASA to abandon all ocean research. They classified everything. They silenced everyone who tried to speak about it. I have proof, documents, testimony from scientists who were there, film footage showing one of these structures. It's all real, Thomas. Every conspiracy theory about NASA hiding ocean discoveries, it's all based on truth. They just got the reason wrong. We didn't find aliens from space. We found something that was already here. I'm going to release everything tomorrow morning. I've made multiple copies. I've distributed them to people I trust. If anything happens to me, make sure this gets out. Make sure people know. Humanity deserves to know we're not alone. We've never been alone." She hung up. Then she sent encrypted files to 3 other colleagues, academics who specialised in government transparency and scientific fraud. The files contained everything she had found: copies of the classified documents, Harlan Vick's testimony, the digitised film footage, photographs of the naval facility. At 6 a.m, she packed her laptop, her camera and the original documents into her bag. She checked out of the hotel and started driving toward Honolulu International Airport. Her flight wasn't until evening, but she wanted to be somewhere public, somewhere with security cameras and witnesses. She never made it to the airport. At 8:15 in the morning, a highway patrol officer found Lena's rental car abandoned on Highway 3, a relatively quiet stretch of road about 12 miles outside of Pearl Harbor. The engine was still running, the driver's door was open, her keys were in the ignition. Her phone was on the passenger seat, battery removed and placed carefully beside it. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence of an accident. The car showed no damage. There were no skid marks on the road. Her suitcase was still in the trunk. Her purse was still in the front seat, wallet and credit cards intact. Lena Hart Boone had simply vanished. Within 6 hours, federal agents arrived at the scene. They took the car, they took everything in it, and they issued orders to local police that this was now a federal matter. No press releases, no public statements. The investigation would be handled at a higher level. Within 12 hours, more federal agents raided Lena's apartment in Maryland. They arrived with a warrant so heavily redacted that the property manager couldn't even tell what specific items they were authorized to seize. They took her computer, her files, her backup drives, her notebooks. They took everything. They interviewed her colleagues at the archive facility. The interviews were polite but firm. They explained that Lena had been involved in unauthorized access of classified materials, that her recent behaviour suggested significant psychological stress, that anyone who had received documents from her should turn them over immediately and refrain from discussing her work with anyone, as doing so could result in serious legal consequences. The official statement from authorities was brief and carefully worded. Lena Hart Boone had been reported missing. Her vehicle had been found abandoned in Hawaii. There was no evidence of foul play. Given her recent behaviour and the stress she had been under, authorities believed she may have wandered away from her vehicle in a state of confusion or distress. Search efforts were underway. The public was asked to contact authorities if they had any information. No mention of classified documents. No mention of NASA or ocean exploration. No mention of what she'd been researching. Just a troubled woman who had disappeared, probably due to mental health issues. Nothing more to see here. Thomas Brennan received the voicemail that evening when he woke up for his night shift at the archive facility. He listened to it 3 times, his blood chilling more with each repetition. He immediately checked his encrypted email and found the files Lena had sent him. Everything she had mentioned. All the proof. For 2 days he debated what to do. Then 2 federal agents appeared at his home. They were polite, professional. They explained that Lena had been suffering from a mental health crisis, that she had been accessing classified materials without authorization, that any documents she had shared were the product of her deteriorating mental state and should not be taken seriously. They asked if she'd sent him anything, if she'd shared her theories with him, if he had any of her documents. Thomas lied. He said no. He said Lena had seemed stressed lately but hadn't shared any specifics of her work. He said he was worried about her and hoped she would be found safely. The agents thanked him and left, but Thomas noticed the car parked down the street that evening, and the next evening, and the evening after that. He deleted the encrypted files without looking at them again. He erased Lena's voicemail. He told himself he was being smart, not cowardly, that he had a family to think about, that getting himself killed or disappeared wouldn't honour Lena's sacrifice. The other colleagues Lena had sent files to made similar choices. The risks were too great. The evidence could be dismissed as forgery. The penalties for possessing classified materials were severe. One by one, they deleted the files or turned them over to authorities. Within a week, it was as if Lena's entire investigation had never existed. But 1 week after her disappearance, on a Thursday at 2:17 in the morning, a single document appeared on an anonymous forum dedicated to government conspiracies and unexplained phenomena. The forum had existed for years, a place where people shared theories about everything, from UFOs to assassinations to hidden technologies. Most of it was speculation and wishful thinking. This post was different. It was uploaded from an untraceable account that had been created minutes before the post appeared. The routing data, analysed later by forum administrators and independent researchers, showed the post had bounced through 17 different countries, using VPN services and proxy servers to obscure its origin. Whoever posted it understood digital security in a way that suggested either professional training or serious paranoia. The post contained a comprehensive summary of everything Lena had discovered. The 1976 and 77 ocean missions, the classified documents showing NASA's sudden withdrawal, the testimony from deceased scientists, the description of structures found in the deepest trenches, the geometric lattice pattern connecting the anomaly sites across the Pacific, and it included a scanned page from what appeared to be a classified government memorandum, marked with security classifications that verified it as authentic. to anyone who understood government document formatting. The memo was dated March 1979 and included partial text from what was clearly the Abyss Protocol. The post read, "We didn't stop exploring the ocean because we couldn't. We stopped because we were told not to disturb what's down there. They've been watching us for as long as we've been watching the stars. The Abyss Protocol isn't about preventing contact. It's about managing a relationship that began long before NASA was even founded. Someone made an agreement. We stay in the atmosphere and space. They stay in the deep ocean. As long as neither side violates the boundary, we coexist. But if we go back down there, if we start probing again with modern technology, the agreement ends, and nobody in power wants to know what happens then." The post was live for exactly 5 minutes. In that time, 47 people viewed it. 12 took screenshots. 3 downloaded the attached document. Then it was gone, deleted. The account that posted it vanished from the server logs as if it had never existed. The forum's administrators received an official government order within an hour, demanding they surrender all server logs, IP addresses, and any cached versions of the deleted content. The order came with specific federal statute citations and a warning that failure to comply would result in the forum being shut down and its operators facing criminal charges. The administrators complied. They turned over everything they had. But the technical analysis showed something the government didn't want to acknowledge. Whoever posted that information had skills that exceeded typical internet users. The routing was sophisticated. The security measures were professional grade. This wasn't some random conspiracy theorist. This was someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had planned this carefully. The 12 people who had taken screenshots began sharing them on other platforms. Reddit, Twitter, obscure forums dedicated to ocean mysteries. For about 48 hours, the story gained traction. People debated whether the documents were real. Amateur analysts examined the formatting and concluded the memo appeared authentic. Researchers dug into NASA's history and confirmed that the agency had indeed abandoned ocean programs in the late 1970s with minimal explanation. Then the systematic suppression began. Posts were removed from major platforms, sometimes within minutes of being uploaded. Accounts were suspended for spreading misinformation. Fact-checking organisations issued statements saying the documents had been examined and deemed false, though they never explained who examined them or what specific evidence proved them fraudulent. Within a week, the story had been effectively scrubbed from mainstream internet platforms. It remained only in the darker corners of the web, on encrypted forums and conspiracy sites where it blended in with hundreds of other unverifiable claims about government secrets. The official narrative became fixed. Lena Hart Boone had experienced a mental health crisis. She had developed paranoid delusions about government cover-ups. She had fabricated or altered documents to support her theories. Her disappearance was tragic, but likely the result of her deteriorating mental state. The documents she supposedly found were either forgeries or legitimate materials taken wildly out of context. Researchers who looked into the story found nothing solid to grasp. Lena's disappearance was real and documented, but the content of her research was impossible to verify. The documents she supposedly found had vanished. The people she interviewed were dead or refused to speak. The footage no longer existed in any archive, public or private. Even the forum post couldn't be verified since the original had been deleted, and the screenshots could have been fabricated. For a few weeks, the story circulated among communities interested in government conspiracies and hidden knowledge. Then it faded, replaced by newer theories and more recent mysteries. Lena Hart Boone became another name on a long list of people who claimed to have found something significant, and then disappeared. Another unsolved mystery. Another story that couldn't be proven or disproven. But in late October 2023, on a Saturday morning when most of America was sleeping in or having breakfast with their families, something happened that brought the whole story roaring back. A satellite image appeared on an anonymous image-sharing platform. Not one of the major social media sites, but a smaller platform used primarily by researchers and scientists to share large technical files. The image was uploaded at 6:32 in the morning Eastern Time from an account with no history, no profile information, and a username that was just a random string of numbers and letters. The metadata had been carefully stripped from the image file, making it impossible to determine when or by what satellite it had been captured. But analysis of the photograph itself, conducted later by independent researchers with expertise in satellite imaging, suggested it came from a commercial constellation that provided high-resolution ocean imagery for scientific research. The specific characteristics of the image, the angle, the resolution, and the wavelength sensitivity all matched known specifications of satellites operated by a European space agency that sold data commercially. The image showed a section of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth, Challenger Deep, nearly 7 miles below the ocean surface, over 35,000 feet down, a place where pressure exceeds 16,000 pounds per square inch, a place where humans have visited only 4 times in all of history. The last visit had been 2 years earlier. The resolution was extraordinary. Modern satellite technology, using advanced synthetic aperture radar and other sensing methods, could penetrate water to surprising depths and create detailed maps of seafloor topography. This image had been processed to show bathymetric features with clarity that was almost shocking. And visible in the image, clear enough to leave absolutely no doubt, was a perfectly symmetrical hexagonal structure. Each side measured over 10 miles in length. The formation was slightly elevated from the surrounding seafloor, rising about 800 feet above the base level, as if it were sitting on the surface rather than being part of the natural geological formation. The edges were too precise to be natural, the angles too perfect, the symmetry too exact. But what made the image truly extraordinary was the thermal data overlaid on the visual imagery. The satellite had infrared capability, and someone had processed the data to show temperature variations across the scanned area. The structure was glowing, not with visible light, but with heat. At a depth where the ambient temperature should be just above freezing, barely 2 degrees Celsius, this structure was radiating warmth. The thermal signature showed temperatures ranging from 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, significantly above ambient. The pattern wasn't uniform either. There were areas of higher temperature, suggesting internal heat sources or power generation. The heat radiated outward in a way that suggested active systems, not passive geological warming from volcanic activity. And at the centre of the hexagon, there appeared to be an opening, a dark space where both the visual and thermal signatures dropped significantly, as if something was channeling that energy inward or allowing access to whatever was below. The opening was roughly circular, about 2 miles in diameter, and perfectly centred within the hexagonal structure. The surrounding seafloor showed no similar features, just the structure, sitting alone in the darkness of the deepest place on Earth, active and warm and geometrically impossible. The image included a scale bar and coordinates. Anyone with basic knowledge of geographic information systems could verify that this was indeed Challenger Deep, at precisely the deepest measured point in the Mariana Trench. The location matched historical records of depth measurements and previous mapping efforts. Within the first hour, the image was viewed by 300 people, scientists, researchers, ocean enthusiasts, and people who followed maritime mysteries. Many of them downloaded the full resolution file. Some immediately began analysing it, checking the metadata, examining the pixels for signs of manipulation or forgery. Their initial findings were disturbing. The image didn't show obvious signs of digital manipulation. The noise patterns were consistent with legitimate satellite imagery. The compression artifacts looked natural. The thermal data aligned properly with the visual data in ways that would be extremely difficult to fake convincingly. The post that accompanied the image contained no explanation, no manifesto, no detailed claims. Just the image and a title that sent chills through everyone who read it. NASA was right to leave. Within 6 minutes of being posted, the image was gone. The account deleted. The platform's administrators later reported that they had received what appeared to be an automated takedown request citing national security concerns. The request had come with federal authentication codes that the administrators had no way to verify or challenge. But by then, it was too late. 300 downloads had already been made, screenshots had been captured, the image had been shared to other platforms, and once something reaches the internet, it never truly disappears. Over the next 48 hours, the image spread. Reddit communities dedicated to ocean mysteries erupted in debate. Twitter accounts shared compressed versions. YouTube videos analysing the image began appearing, some racking up hundreds of thousands of views before they too were removed for unspecified violations of community guidelines. Independent analysts worked to verify the image's authenticity. Several with expertise in satellite imaging concluded that it appeared to be legitimate. The thermal characteristics were consistent with real infrared data. The bathymetric details matched known features of the Mariana Trench. If it was a fake, it was an extraordinarily sophisticated one that would have required access to genuine satellite data and considerable technical expertise. But verification was impossible, because nobody could identify the source satellite or the capture date. The European Space Agency that operated the most likely satellite constellation denied having any knowledge of the image. When pressed for their own imagery of that location, they stated that their satellites didn't routinely image Challenger Deep due to limited commercial interest, and any existing imagery was restricted for purchase by licensed researchers only. Governments refused to comment. NASA issued a carefully worded statement saying they had no current ocean exploration programs and couldn't verify the authenticity of any images being circulated on social media. They encouraged people to be skeptical of unverified information from unknown sources. The Navy simply declined to respond to inquiries from journalists. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released a statement explaining that seafloor features could sometimes appear geometric due to natural geological processes, and that thermal anomalies near trenches were often caused by volcanic activity or unique pressure conditions. They made no specific reference to the image in question, and didn't address why this particular formation was so perfectly hexagonal, or why it was located at a point with no known volcanic activity. But researchers who knew where to look found something interesting that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. In the weeks following the leaked image, there was a significant and measurable increase in military ship activity near the Mariana Trench. Data from commercial ship tracking services, which monitor vessel movements using AS transponders, showed unusual patterns. Naval vessels that official records claimed were conducting routine exercises in other parts of the Pacific had their transponders go dark for extended periods. When they reappeared, their position suggested they had been operating near the Mariana Trench during those dark periods. Submarine activity, which is harder to track but can be inferred from support vessel movements, and military communication patterns also increased. Attack submarines require surface support ships for long-range operations. The movement of these support vessels suggested increased submarine presence in the region. Scientific research vessels that had been scheduled to work in that region suddenly had their permits revoked without explanation. Applications for new research permits were denied or indefinitely delayed. Independent researchers who tried to book commercial deep-sea exploration found that the coordinates they requested were unavailable due to unspecified military operations. Amateur satellite watchers, people who track military reconnaissance satellites as a hobby, noticed that several satellites altered their orbits to provide more frequent coverage of the Challenger Deep area. The orbital changes were small but measurable, suggesting someone wanted more regular imaging of that specific location. Commercial fishing vessels reported increased military presence. Boats that had been working in international waters for decades suddenly found themselves being approached by Navy ships and asked to relocate. The requests were polite but firm. The explanations were vague. Ongoing operations, safety concerns, routine exercises. But the fishing captains who had worked those waters for years had never seen that kind of military activity before. Radio operators who monitor military frequencies reported increased encrypted communications on channels known to be used for submarine operations. The volume of traffic suggested significant coordination efforts, the kind that would accompany major operational deployment, not routine exercises. None of this information appeared in mainstream news. Individual pieces of it showed up on specialized forums, maritime industry publications, and military tracking websites. but nobody connected all the pieces into a comprehensive picture, or if they did, they didn't publish it. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Something was happening in the Mariana Trench. The military was responding to something, and whatever it was, they didn't want civilian scientists or researchers anywhere near it. One commercial pilot, flying a regular route from Japan to Australia that passed within range of the Mariana Trench, reported seeing unusual surface activity during a night flight. He described seeing what looked like bioluminescence, except the pattern was too regular, too geometric. He filed a routine observation report, as pilots are required to do for any unusual phenomena. The report was acknowledged, then classified. When he tried to discuss it later with colleagues, he was visited by two men who identified themselves as air safety investigators. They explained that his observation had been determined to be a misidentification of fishing vessel lights, and that further discussion of the matter could impact his pilot certification. He stopped talking about it. A marine biologist conducting independent research on deep-sea species, using a small autonomous underwater vehicle she had built herself, submitted a request to operate near the Challenger Deep. Her request was denied. When she asked for an explanation, she was told that military operations were ongoing in the region, and all civilian research activities were temporarily suspended for safety reasons. When she asked when the suspension would be lifted, she was told that information was not available. 6 months later, the suspension was still in effect. Something was happening in the deep ocean, something that required a military presence, something that someone in power didn't want civilian scientists, researchers, or the general public getting close to. And it was happening at the exact location where a satellite image had shown an impossible structure. The Abyss Protocol, it seemed, was still very much in effect, and whatever agreement or decision had been made in 1979 was being actively enforced in 2023. The Abyss Protocol, it seemed, was still very much in effect. Today, if you search for information about NASA's ocean exploration programs from the 1970s, you'll find basic historical facts. The partnership with NOAA, the development of deep ocean technology, the successful missions that mapped volcanic vents and discovered new species, straightforward, unremarkable history. But you won't find anything about why it ended so abruptly. You won't find details about the anomalies that were reported. You won't find the names of the scientists who tried to speak out and died under circumstances that were always ruled natural or accidental. All of that has been scrubbed, classified, or lost to time. In March of 2024, a Freedom of Information request was filed asking for all NASA documents related to ocean exploration programs from 1975 to 1980. The request was filed by a law firm representing an anonymous client. 3 months later, the response arrived. 7,000 pages of documents so heavily redacted that entire sections were nothing but black bars. Page after page of blacked-out text with only occasional phrases visible. Depth readings nominal. Equipment functioning as expected. Mission concluded successfully. Nothing about the anomalies. Nothing about the structures. Nothing about the decision to end all ocean programs. Just routine operational reports with anything meaningful removed. The law firm filed an appeal, arguing that excessive redaction violated the spirit of transparency laws. The appeal was denied. The stated reason: matters of national security. No further explanation provided. On July 4th, 2024, during a holiday weekend when most Americans were watching fireworks and having barbecues, the Mariana Trench Marine National Monument was quietly expanded. Expansion added nearly 30,000 square miles of protected ocean to the monument, including the entire area around Challenger Deep. The expansion came with new restrictions: no commercial fishing, no research without specific federal permits, no unauthorized vessel activity. The announcement was buried in a routine Department of the Interior press release that mentioned several unrelated administrative actions. No press conference, no statements from the White House, just a few paragraphs in a document that most news organizations never bothered to read. The restrictions were immediate and strictly enforced. The Coast Guard began regular patrols of the expanded monument area. Any vessel entering without proper authorization was intercepted and escorted out. The penalties for violation were severe, fines up to $250,000 and potential criminal charges. When environmental groups asked about the sudden expansion and increased restrictions, they were told it was part of ongoing efforts to protect unique deep-sea ecosystems from disturbance. When marine researchers applied for permits to study the newly protected areas, their applications were either denied or delayed indefinitely pending unspecified security reviews. The message was clear. The deepest parts of the Mariana Trench were now effectively off-limits to everyone, except those with the highest security clearances. In November 2024, a research paper was published in an obscure marine biology journal. The paper, written by a team of Japanese scientists, described acoustic anomalies detected near several deep ocean trenches between 2020 and 2022. The anomalies consisted of low-frequency sounds that didn't match any known biological or geological sources. The frequencies suggested possible mechanical origins. The patterns suggested possible intelligence. The paper was peer-reviewed and published. It remained available for exactly 9 days. Then it was retracted. The journal issued a statement saying the data had been found to contain errors, and the conclusions were not supported by the evidence. The authors protested, claiming their data was sound, and the retraction was unjustified. Their protests were ignored. Copies of the paper exist in academic archives and can still be found by determined researchers, but its retraction means it can't be cited in other scientific work, effectively erasing it from legitimate scientific discourse. The ocean covers more than 70% of Earth's surface. The average depth is over 2 miles. More than 80% has never been mapped in detail. We have better topographic maps of Mars than we do of our own seafloor. The technology exists to change that. Autonomous underwater vehicles, advanced sonar arrays, satellite bathymetry, deep-sea submersibles that can withstand pressures in the deepest trenches. We could map the entire ocean floor if we chose to. We could explore every trench, every abyssal plain, every underwater mountain range. The cost would be substantial, but not prohibitive. Less than what we spend on space exploration in a single year. The scientific value would be immense. New species, new geological knowledge, better understanding of ocean currents and climate systems, potential resources. But we don't do it. Year after year, the deep ocean remains largely unexplored. Research funding goes to space programs instead. Mars rovers and Jupiter probes and telescopes looking at distant galaxies. We search for life on other planets while leaving most of our own planet unexplored. The official explanations make sense on the surface. The ocean is difficult to explore. The pressure is crushing. The darkness is absolute. The equipment required is expensive and specialized. Space captures public imagination in ways the ocean doesn't. Funding decisions are complex and based on multiple factors. All of that is true. But it doesn't explain the classified documents. It doesn't explain why scientists who asked too many questions ended up dead. It doesn't explain why certain coordinates are now off limits to civilian research. It doesn't explain the Abyss Protocol. There are places on Earth where humans are not permitted to go. Military installations, nuclear facilities, government research centres. We accept these restrictions as necessary for security. We understand that some things need to be kept secret for legitimate reasons. But the deep ocean isn't a military base or a nuclear facility. It's a natural part of our planet. It was here billions of years before humans existed. Restricting access to it, controlling who can explore it, hiding what's been found there. These actions suggest something more than routine security concerns. They suggest something was discovered that changed the fundamental understanding of who we are and whether we're alone. Something that people in power decided we're not ready to know. Something that has been kept secret for 50 years through classification, suppression, and when necessary, elimination of anyone who came too close to the truth. Marvin Eldridge died in 1978. Harlan Vick died in 2022. Lena Hart Boone disappeared in 2023. These are just the names we know. How many others were silenced? How many scientists, researchers, technicians and engineers took secrets to their graves? How many chose silence over the risk of speaking out? The Abyss Protocol wasn't about preventing contact with something unknown. It was about managing information, controlling what humanity knows about its own planet, maintaining a narrative that humans are the only intelligent species on Earth, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Someone, somewhere, made the decision that this secret was worth keeping, that whatever exists in the deep ocean should remain there, undisturbed and unknown, that NASA should explore space instead, that the public should believe we stopped exploring the oceans simply because space was more interesting. And for 50 years that decision has held, through changes in presidential administrations, through shifts in public opinion, through advances in technology that would make discovery easier. The secret has been maintained. Documents remain classified. Witnesses remain silent or dead. Research remains restricted. The satellite image from 2023 showed something that should not exist in nature. A hexagonal structure over 60 miles in perimeter, sitting at the deepest point on Earth, radiating heat, with an opening at its centre. It existed for 6 minutes on the internet before being scrubbed. But those who saw it remember. The structure is still there. The thermal signature hasn't changed. Military vessels continue to patrol the area. Permits continue to be denied. And somewhere in classified facilities, people monitor those depths, watching for changes, for activity, for signs that whatever agreement or understanding exists might be breaking down. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and in the crushing darkness of the deepest trenches, at pressures that would instantly kill any human, beneath miles of water where no light has ever reached, something exists. Something with geometric precision. Something that radiates heat. Something that noticed when we came looking in the 1970s and responded by shutting down our equipment. Something that may have been here long before humans walked the Earth. Something that built structures in the deep ocean for purposes we can't begin to understand. Something that someone in power encountered and then decided humanity was better off not knowing about. NASA didn't choose space over ocean. They were pushed into space, ordered to look up instead of down, told to search for life on distant planets while ignoring the evidence of non-human intelligence right here on Earth. The choice was made, the protocol was established, and for 50 years it has been enforced with classification protocols, funding redirection, permit restrictions, and when necessary, permanent silence. The truth is down there, in the Mariana Trench, in the Puerto Rico Trench, in the Tonga Trench, in the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible places on our planet, waiting, watching, existing, and we have been told to leave it alone. Perhaps that was the right decision. Perhaps there are discoveries that humanity isn't ready for. Perhaps there are truths that would fundamentally break our understanding of the world in ways we couldn't recover from. Or perhaps those in power simply made a choice that they're not the ones suffering. They're not the ones who died asking questions, and they're not the ones who have to live with the weight of suppressed knowledge. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. It holds secrets we haven't even begun to imagine. And somewhere, in a facility with the highest security clearance, in a room where the protocols are enforced and the decisions are made, someone knows exactly what those secrets are. They've known since 1978. And they've decided you shouldn't.